Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're traveling to the islands of Japan to trace the long and fascinating story of its ancient past. How did small communities of farmers and fishermen grow into powerful clans and kingdoms? What role did nature, mountains, and the sea play in shaping their culture? And how did myths of gods and ancestors blend with real history to form the foundations of Japan? We'll look at the Jomon and Yayoi periods, the rise of early emperors, the spread of Buddhism, and the shaping of traditions that lasted for centuries. It is a story of change and continuity, of battles and beliefs, of a people finding their place between the land and the sea. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're here to fall asleep or simply to learn something new, I'm glad you've joined me. Now, let's begin. If you open Japan's oldest books, you begin with God standing on a heavenly bridge and stirring the sea with a jeweled spear. The brine drips, hardens, and becomes an island. The gods step down to see what they have made. This is the tone of the Kojiki, compiled in 712, and the Nihon Shoki, finished in 720. They are part family album and part origin story, written to explain how the world began, how the islands of Japan appeared, and why a particular line of rulers should sit on the throne. Both works were created at court, with an eye on politics as much as piety, yet they remain invaluable. They preserve the earliest names, rites, and how the early Japanese imagined their place in the universe. The divine couple, Izanagi and Izanami, received the task of giving shape to the land. They beget islands and the first deities. Tragedy arrives early. Izanami dies, giving birth to the fire god, and Izanagi descends to the shadowy land of the dead to bring her back. He fails, flees, and purifies himself in a river. From that act of washing emerge three great deities who will shape the story to come. Amaterasu, the sun goddess, appears from his left eye. Tsukuyomi, the moon god, from his right. Susanoo, the stormy one, from his nose. The symbolism is clear even if the details are odd. Light, time, weather, a full working sky. Amaterasu becomes the heart of the narrative. She retreats into a cave after one of Susanoo's rages, and the world goes dim. The gods lure her out with a mirror and a bawdy dance. This is not a modern diplomatic solution, but it works. Light returns, order returns, and the mirror that enticed her becomes one of three sacred objects that anchor imperial authority. Along with a curved jewel and a sword, it will form the regalia of later emperors. You can still see the places tied to this story in living practice. The grand shrine at Ise is dedicated to Amaterasu. Its main halls are rebuilt every 20 years, in a meticulous cycle that preserves skills and materials as much as buildings. The craft is as important as the shrine itself. The sword has its own legends, including a tale of slaying a many-headed serpent in Izumo. The jewel, a polished magatama, speaks to a very old fondness for curved beads that stretches back into prehistoric graves. At this point, the chronicles pivot. The gods hand the land to human rulers. The descent of Ninigi, Amaterasu's grandson, brings the regalia into the world of people. His great-grandson, Jimmu, becomes the first emperor. The date given for his accession is 660 before the Common Era. No one takes that date as a literal fact in the way one might record a coronation today. But the point is not the number. The point is continuity. The emperors claim to be of the sun. That claim turns out to be very useful in a society that is knitting together clans and regions and needs a single, luminous story. If you want to see how religion, authority, and landscape lock together, the early myths are a helpful guide. The islands are not just places on a map. They are the work of gods, with very human moods. Rivers need pacifying. Volcanoes need respect. Mountains are homes for spirits that prefer proper offerings and tidy rituals. Shinto, the native way, grows from this view. It is not a book-bound religion. There are no prophets dictating chapters. There are shrines at groves, springs, and peaks, priests who mind the rites, and a language of purity and pollution that touches everything from harvest festivals to the start of a building project. The rites are practical and social as well as sacred. They mark seasons, settle nerves, and bind communities to the land. The court that produced the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki had practical aims. By the early 8th century, the rulers in Nara were adopting Chinese-style administration, law codes, and a city laid out in a grid. They needed an origin that matched that scale. A divine pedigree did two things at once. It made the throne more than a chair in a palace. It also allowed the court to fold local cults into a national story. Shrines to mountain and harvest deities could be recognized as guardians of the realm, and their priests could be brought into the web of court rank and duty. In this way, politics did not replace religion. It partnered with it. The myths also remember rivalries and regional pride in their own way. Izumo, on the Sea of Japan coast, features strongly in tales of Susanoo and of an early cession of the land to the heavenly line. You can visit Izumo Taisha today, one of the oldest and most revered shrines, with its immense rope and quiet precincts. The story says that earthly rulers gave up the land in exchange for divine favor and a grand shrine. Read politically, the tale acknowledges that other lineages mattered and that accommodation was wiser than erasure. The court wove a tapestry rather than cutting new cloth. None of this prevents the myths from being lively. Susanoo is a difficult brother who throws a skinned horse into his sister's weaving hall. Amaterasu is proud, wounded, and coaxed with a mirror. The gods bicker, laugh, and sometimes behave badly. The tone is often closer to a family saga than a sermon, which may explain why the stories have lasted. They sound like people, even when they are stars. Archaeology gives the scene a deeper backdrop. Long before the chronicles were written, people in the islands were shaping clay, fishing coasts, and moving through forests rich with nuts and game. Magatama beads appear in graves across many centuries, a neat echo of the jewel in the regalia. Mirrors and swords become prized in elite tombs. When the texts name a mirror, a sword, and a jewel as the anchors of rule, they are also naming things people already valued. Symbols only work if they feel familiar in the hand. One other point is worth noting. The early chronicles were compiled in a time of intense exchange with the continent. Buddhism had arrived from Korea, writing had been adopted from China. Law codes and calendars had been studied and copied. In that world, the court chose not to present the emperor as a son of a foreign heaven, but as the heir of the sun that rises over these islands. It is a careful balance. Learn from abroad, rule at home. The result is a mythic package that is local in flavor and expansive in use. If you stand at Ise during a quiet morning, you see cypress timbers silvered by age, fresh reeds on the roofs, gravel raked clean, and a line of visitors who bow before they cross. Beyond the main precinct, the carpenters are already seasoning wood and preparing the next shrine because the calendar insists on renewal. That is as close to a summary of ancient Japanese belief as one can manage. Honor the past, rebuild it, keep the craft alive, and do not pretend that permanence is the goal. The sun rises, the shrine is rebuilt, the story is told again. Set the myths on the shelf for a moment and step into a smoke-scented village on a cool morning many thousands of years ago. A ring of low thatched roofs sits among nut trees. Beyond the houses, a river slides past with salmon moving like silver thoughts. This is Jomon, Japan, No kings, no palaces. Just communities that learned how to stay put without becoming farmers in the strict sense, and who somehow managed to keep that way of life for longer than most civilizations exist at all. Archaeologists named them for their pots. Jomen means cord marked, a plain description for pottery pressed with twisted rope when the clay was soft. The label is modest, the accomplishment is not. These are among the oldest ceramics on Earth. The earliest pieces appear before 15,000 years ago, fired in open hearths and used to simmer fish or boil nuts. By the middle of the Jomen story, around 2000 BC, the pots erupt into extravagance. Flames of clay lick upward from the rims, loops twist and curl. The vessels look like bonfires that decided to harden. Some were practical, some were ceremonial. All tell you that these villagers had time and taste, and the desire to turn a cooking jar into something that could stop you in your tracks. People who make such things are not drifting camp to camp. The Jomen built pit dwellings, circular or oval rooms dug into the soil and roofed with timber and reed. A hearth burned at the center. Smoke cured meat and likely drove mosquitoes mad. In winter, the floor stayed warm. In summer, it stayed cool. Storage pits dotted the village edges. The Jomen filled them with acorns and chestnuts after leaching out the bitterness in running water, with dried fish from the weirs set across streams, with roots and bulbs dug from nearby wetlands. They hunted deer and boar with stone-tipped arrows and spears. They fished lakes and coasts with bone hooks and barbed harpoons. They tied nets and weighted them with shaped stones. The scene is not a romantic wilderness. It is a tended landscape. There is good evidence that people managed chestnut groves and coaxed useful plants to thrive closer to home. Not farming as it would arrive later, but a steady push towards security. If you want to see what mattered to them beyond dinner, pick up a dog. These small clay figures turn up from Hokkaido to Kyushu with eyes like goggles, hips that speak of fertility, and bodies incised with patterns that may be clothing or may be symbols. Some were carefully broken at the limbs and left in dwellings or pits. That deliberate act looks very much like a ritual, a way to carry off sickness or misfortune by destroying a stand-in. No one wrote down the instructions, so we infer from fragments and from echoes in later folk practice. There are many varieties. Some are tiny and simple. Others are shaped with a care that suggests a maker who had seen many made before. They are not toys and not trinkets. They look like the physical side of prayers. The Jomen toolkit is a lesson in patience and skill. Stone axes were polished until they gleamed. Grindstones worked seeds and pigments. Awls of bone pierced hides for clothing and nets. Basketry was so fine that people brushed sap from lacquer trees on the surfaces to make them hard and glossy. The earliest use of lacquer in the world comes from these islands. The result is not a courtly tea bowl, but a basket that can carry weight without fraying in the rain. Craft was not confined to what a village could find underfoot. Shiny black obsidian from Nagano traveled far along river routes. Beautiful green jade from Niigata moved in the other direction. Those paths tell us about trade and contact. Even a small hamlet knew of neighbors 2 valleys away, and those neighbors knew of others beyond them. The archipelago was a web of exchange long before rice fields stitched the lowlands together. The coastline kept changing under their feet. As the ice sheets withdrew, seas rose and drowned plains, then eased into new shores. Shell middens trace the adjustments. These long-mounded heaps of oyster and clam shell are the Jomen archive. Within them are fish bones and bird bones, charcoal from hearths, seeds from plants, broken pots, worked antler, and sometimes the curled remains of someone who lived there. Many Jomen communities buried their dead in or near the places where they slept and cooked. The living and the dead shared space. The practice gave villagers a memory deeper than anyone alive could carry. Because the Jomen lasted so long, there is no single snapshot that fits every century. Scholars divide the span into phases so they can talk about change with some precision. In the Middle Jomon, around 2000 BC, population rises, villages grow, pottery becomes bold, and large communal structures appear at sites like Sanai Mariyama in the far north. There you can stand among reconstructed houses and a great six-post tower and feel how a settlement of hundreds once worked as a single organism. Later, the climate turns cooler and wetter. Game shifts its range. Nuts are less reliable. Villages contract. Pottery settles into quieter forms with straighter rims and plainer bodies. The culture bends but does not break. All through these centuries, there is a clear fondness for the polished comma-shaped bead called the Magatama. They show up in graves and caches, carved from jade or agate, and sometimes from glass when that becomes available. It is pleasing that the early myths later chose a mirror, a sword, and a jewel as the marks of rule, because for Jomon people mirrors were rare, swords were precious blades, and jewels were things you could hold and admire. Symbols grow from habits. Not every region moved in step. Hokkaido held to hunting and fishing well into the time when rice farmers arrived to the south. The Pacific coast and the inland seas gave different diets and different tool sets. Yet the style of the pottery and the presence of familiar tools knit the islands into a recognizably Jomon world. You can trace a pattern from Kyushu to Tohoku and see cousins at work. Contact with the continent was a fact, not a theory. Drift voyages carry people whether they plan it or not. Storms blow canoes from one shore to another. Obsidian and jade prove long paths within the islands. Shell ornaments from warm waters appear far to the north. Some influences may have come across in stories as well as objects. What the Jomon did not do is adopt farming on a large scale. That choice, or perhaps that absence of choice, is what gives the period its character. Communities found ways to stay fed and to stay in place without the cereal fields that defined life in so many other parts of the world. The last centuries before new ideas arrived from Korea are full of small signs of strain and invention. Fishing weirs become more elaborate. Settlements choose sites with better access to varied foods. Storage practices improve. At the same time, there are fewer of the extravagant flame-rim pots. House forms in some areas change to suit wetter ground. You can almost hear the conversation across a village fire. Will the deer return to the low hills? Will the salmon run be strong? Do we travel to the coast to trade this year or wait for them to come inland? The answers changed by decade, but the capacity to adjust had been learned over millennia. When rice, agriculture, and metal tools began to spread from the continent around the 3rd century before the Common Era, they did not erase the Jomon at a stroke. The change was gradual and uneven. In many places, the new ways layered onto the old. A farmer might still shape a pot with cord marks because that was how her mother taught her. A metal blade might sit beside a polished stone axe because the axe still did one job well. In the north, the Jomon way continued into what scholars call the EPI Jomon. In the south, it blended into what we call Yayoi. The shift tells us that cultures pass batons rather than vanish behind curtains. It helps to fix these facts in human terms. Picture a woman pressing rope into clay while her child watches closely and tries a small pattern on a scrap. Picture a man walking a ridge trail with a bundle of obsidian to trade and a story ready to swap with the first stranger he meets. Picture a group cleaning acorns in a stream and singing the rhythm that makes hard work pass. Picture a small figure of clay held up to the firelight, then broken with care as a sick person lies wrapped and waiting. These are not echoes of a people who failed to progress. They are portraits of a people who learned how to live within the gifts of their place for an astonishing stretch of time. By 2000 BC, which we can hold as a marker for the Middle Jomon, Japan already contained communities that had mastered the art of staying. They built houses that worked with the weather, invented ceramics that were both useful and bold, traded across mountains and bays, and developed rites that stitched life to meaning. The chronicles that would later be written in Nara speak of jewels and swords given by gods. The ground under Nara holds the beads and blades of people who lived that kind of meaning every day. Walk from a Jomon village into a Yayoi village, and you feel the ground change under your feet. The forest thins. The air smells of wet soil and chaff. You hear water moving through ditches. People are standing mid-shin in a square of shallow water, pressing young rice plants into the mud with a steady rhythm. That sight tells you almost everything. The Yayoi period begins when wet rice agriculture arrives in the islands from the continent, most likely by way of the Korean peninsula, and it alters nearly every part of daily life. Villages grow larger. Time is measured by sowing and harvest. New tools flash in the sun. Where Jomon people lived well from woods and water, Yayoi people reshape the landscape and commit to it with dikes and spades. The timing is still debated with the care that archaeologists relish, but a good rule is this. By around the 3rd century before the Common Era, rice paddies are a fact in northern Kyushu and moving east along river plains. You can see them at places like Toro in Shizuoka, where the ghosts of fields are still visible in the soil. At Toro, the remains of ditches and levees show a geometry of labor. Farmers cut channels to divert streams, laid out paddies like a quilt, and built small sluice points to control flow. This was not a casual pastime. Rice needs warm summers and careful watering. It demands teams of people who agree on when to flood and when to drain. That means leaders who can coordinate, neighbors who can cooperate, and rules that keep everything from turning into a shouting match. In short, the first rice fields bring the first real politics down to the village level. Rice changes buildings too. Pit houses remain, but a new structure rises above them. The raised floor granary appears with posts driven deep and a floor lifted well off the ground. Steps are narrow and often removable. The gaps between floor planks allow air to move through. It is a clever solution to rodents and damp. Stand under one on a hot day, and you have a shaded workspace with the smell of drying grain overhead. Inside the granaries sit jars sealed with plant fiber to keep out insects. These jars may look plain beside some Jomon flame pots, but they are tight-lidded and dependable. Food security is the point. The toolkit transforms. Wooden spades and hoes are still everywhere, but now there are iron blades that cut and turn soil with a brisk bite. At first, iron is imported as finished goods or ingots. Later, there is local working of iron bloom. Bronze arrives as well, but it takes a different path. Iron becomes the tool metal. Bronze becomes the metal of ceremony and show. Archaeologists find bronze spearheads and swords that look fine, but are not practical for long field use. They also find bronze mirrors and the famous bronze bells called dotaku. The bells are tall and thin with flanges and handles. Many are decorated with images that show deer, boats, birds, and what might be farmers in the fields. They are almost always found buried on hilltops or in clusters away from settlements, as if communities brought them out for rituals and then returned them to the earth when the ritual was done. If you want a picture of Yayoi belief in a single object, a dotaku is hard to beat. It rings with the sound of coordinated work and of seasons that begin and end with the first gloss of green in the paddies. Pottery calms down in form and rises in function. Yayoi pots are often thinner, smoother, and more regular than Jomon pots. The chord marks give way to burnished surfaces and simple bands. The shapes suit cooking grains and storing liquids. This is the cookware of daily labor. It is still made with skill, just aimed at a table that feeds many mouths after a day in the mud. Villages enlarge and fortify. At Yoshinogari in Kyushu, you can walk through a reconstruction of long palisades, watchtowers, and moats that once circled a large settlement. This is not the architecture of a people who expect all neighbors to be friendly. When food is stored in granaries and land is divided into ditches and plots, disputes become sharper. Prestige goods like iron blades or bronze mirrors also attract envy. Burial evidence shows clear social ranking. Some graves contain the basics. Others hold fine ornaments, weapons, and mirrors that came from beyond the sea. That gap hints at the rise of chiefs who can command labor, collect surplus, host feasts, and wage war if they must. Textiles become more common. Spindle whorls and loom weights are found in yayoi layers across the islands. Hemp and ramie provide strong fibers for cloth. Some items of silk appear later, but remain rare and precious. With cloth comes status that can be worn. A chief has robes that announce his rank. A priestess has garments reserved for ritual. You can almost see the color and feel the texture, even if time has faded both from the soil. Trade and travel knit islands and continents together. Obsidian and jade still move within Japan, but now there are iron tools and bronze mirrors from the mainland, glass beads that flash in the sun, and perhaps even ideas about how a village should be governed. The Han commanderies in the Korean peninsula serve as bridges for goods and news. Contacts with the continent also bring writing, at first as marks on imported items, and later as an idea that will rework Japanese culture at its root. For now, the farmers of a Yayoi village do not write their names, but their world is already in the orbit of literate states. Chinese chroniclers give us a peek from the outside. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, they describe the people they call Wa as living in many small countries. Some communities tattoo faces and bodies. Some blacken teeth. Chiefs trade envoys. There are hundreds of polities, and they are not often at peace. This is the Yayoi world seen across the water. It is a picture full of boats, market goods, and quarrelsome neighbors who nevertheless recognize power when they see it. The spread of rice and metal is not even. Northern Kyushu and the inland sea take to the new ways early. The Kinki region fills with villages that will matter for centuries to come. The Kanto Plain begins to change along its many rivers. Hokkaido holds to hunting and fishing much longer and follows its own path. Everywhere the same question is asked in different accents. How far do we flood the field? Who will build the next ditch? Where do we store the harvest? Who speaks for the village when strangers appear at the gate? You can watch knowledge harden into custom in the shovel marks and footprint layers that archaeologists study. A poorly placed levee fails and people learn. The next one holds. A community tries a new sequence for planting and learns that it fits the rains better. The calendar that matters now is not only one of moons and fish runs. It is a calendar of ploughing days, planting days, and the first bending of the stalks under their own weight. Festivals cluster around these moments. Music and bells carry across the paddies on warm evenings as people thank gods for water that came and for insects that stayed away. The practical and the sacred share the same ditch bank. The shift from Jomon to Yayoi is sometimes framed as a clean break between foragers and farmers. The soil tells a subtler story. There are villages where Jomon-style pots continue for a while beside new forms. There are graves where Magatama sit with iron knives. There are tools of polished stone in the same layer as a rusted sickle. People do not swap identities as quickly as they swap a spear for a hoe. They carry habits forward and adjust them to new work. Over the course of centuries, the new way becomes the old way, which is how tradition is formed. Stand finely on the edge of a Yayoi paddy at sunset and you can almost count the consequences. Rice paddies create surplus. Surplus supports specialists. Specialists make better tools and finer ornaments. Better tools and finer ornaments make leaders more impressive. Leaders organize defense and pilgrimage and law. Ditches and embankments teach people to plan as a group and to accept decisions that bind everyone. Those habits do not stop at the village gate, they scale up. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries after the Common Era, powerful clan centers begin to appear in the Kinai and northern Kyushu. Some leaders call themselves kings. They send emissaries and gifts across the sea and receive gifts in return. A famous queen will soon step onto this stage and hold many of these threads in her hands. If you follow the irrigation ditches of the Yayoi countryside into the 3rd century of our era, the scene begins to thicken with rank and ceremony. Rice stores swell. Chiefs grow bolder. Villages hedge their borders with moats and palisades. Trade routes hum with glass beads, bronze mirrors, and iron blades. In this crowded landscape, we begin to hear names. That is the great shift. For the first time, Japan steps into the written record, and it does so through the eyes of its neighbors. Chinese chroniclers kept lists and letters with a zeal that will make any historian grateful. The later Han history notes that in the 1st century, a local ruler in Kyushu received an imperial golden seal. That seal was found in the 18th century on a small island near Fukuoka, with 5 crisp characters that read, King of the Han vassal state of Wa-Na. It is a small object and a large clue. It tells us that by the 1st century there were chiefs who spoke for groups of villages and who wanted recognition from across the sea. The records of the 3 kingdoms in the 3rd century go further. They describe the people of Wa as living in scores of small countries. They tattooed faces, blackened teeth, built palisades, and held markets. They farmed rice and fished and fought. It is a simple portrait, but it has the feeling of truth that comes when tax collectors have sent back notes about who owes what. From this bustle, one figure rises into focus. She is called Himiko. The Chinese texts say that after many years of fighting among rival chiefs, the people chose a woman of great ritual skill to rule. The year often given for her appearance is near the end of the 2nd century. She never married, rarely appeared in public, and governed through male relatives while she consulted the spirits. It is hard not to picture a quiet compound with screens and courtyards, where a priestess queen speaks to messengers through an inner chamber and fields reports about ditches, granaries, and feuds. Himiko's realm is called Yamatai in the Chinese record. Where it lay has been argued over for more than a century. Some scholars set it in northern Kyushu, where trade and embassies first touched shore. Others point east to the Nara Basin, where later power took root and where the earliest, truly monumental tombs rise from the earth. The truth may be that Yamatai was a federation whose center of gravity shifted as alliances formed and broke. What matters for our story is that she held together enough of these small countries to send a proper embassy to the court of Wei in the year we would call 238. That mission was a turning point. The Wei emperor sent back gifts and a letter that recognized Himiko as the friendly ruler of Wa. Among the gifts were bronze mirrors, silks, and a seal with a purple ribbon. Mirrors were not small things. They were the ultimate prestige goods of the day, cast in bronze, polished to a bright face, and incised on the back with crisp designs. They traveled from hand to hand with a force that iron sickles never had. When excavators lift mirrors from tombs in Japan today, they often think of that embassy. 100 mirrors in a single shipment is a tidy thought. It marked a relationship and announced a rank. Chinese notes also mention that Himiko dealt with a troublesome neighbor called Kunu and appealed to Wei for help, which suggests that her authority had limits and that she had the wit to look for support beyond the islands. She ruled into her 70s. When she died around the year 248, the Chronicle says that a great mound more than 100 paces across was raised in her honor, and that over 100 attendants followed her in death. The detail has the cold edge of fact. It also gives us an anchor in the landscape. Somewhere there was a new kind of burial that spoke in earth rather than clay. Tombs on such a scale appear in Japan just when the texts say Himiko lived. They are called kofun, which simply means old mounds, but many are anything but simple. The most distinctive are shaped like a keyhole when seen from above, with a round rear mass joined to a square or trapezoid front. A moat often rings them. Stone-lined chambers within hold the dead and their goods. Clay figures called haniwa stand on the slopes, human and animal and house alike, as if the world of the living were set up in careful miniature to keep the dead company. The earliest of these tombs rise in the Nara Basin and nearby regions during the 3rd century. The largest, which belong to a later generation of rulers, stretch for hundreds of meters and swallow the labor of entire districts. One of them, attributed by tradition to a 5th century sovereign, is longer than many modern airports. The scale is the message. It is tempting to point to the largest of the early mounds and say, here lies Himiko. The most famous candidate is the Hashihaka Mound in Nara, long and graceful, with a name that sounds like a half-remembered story. Some archaeologists see in its date and form a fit with the account of a great queen who knit clans together. Others prefer Kyushu and suggest that later rulers moved the center of power east and raised larger tombs to set their own stamp on history. There is good sense on both sides. For our purposes, what matters is that after Himiko, mound building becomes the hallmark of rule and a new political order blooms. We can sketch that order. Power clustered first in the Kenai region around what is now Nara and Osaka, where wide plains and river deltas made rice and people plentiful. Clan leaders married and fought and merged. A leading lineage rose among them and began to style itself not just as first among equals, but as ruler of the archipelago. The Chinese continued to receive embassies, now not only from Kyushu chiefs, but from a king who called himself the ruler of Wa. In one letter from the 5th century, he even claimed the right to a grandiose continental title. The key instrument of this rise at home was the tomb. To build one, you needed a surplus, a crew chief, and a reason to command hundreds of hands for months on end. The tomb made the chief, and the chief made the tomb. What went into these burials tells us about rank and belief. Mirrors gleam in the light of torches when chambers are opened. Iron swords with distinctive ring pommels rest by the dead. Sets of armor lie where attendants once stood. Strings of Magatama beads curve like commas around a chest. Haniwa stand in files up the flanks, some in the form of warriors with crossed belts, some as musicians, some as simple cylinders that seem to mark out zones like a rope at a shrine. The living world had its firm places. The tomb recites that order back to the earth. Society during this time had teeth. Not every villager lived within a palisade, but enough did that the impression is of constant preparation. At Yoshinagari in Kyushu, the reconstructed towers and long fences show a community on alert and organized. Excavations elsewhere find arrow points lodged in bones and burned layers within settlement pits that speak of raids. Yet the same sites yield loom weights, spindle whirls, and fine combs. Cloth production grew. Women of rank wore garments that announced it. Rank meant the right to speak at councils and the duty to host great communal meals when harvests came in. The power to command labor carried with it the obligation to be generous. In a world without coin, reputation and reciprocity were as good as money. Ritual kept that world in tune. The bronze bells of the Yayoi did not vanish. They appear to have been used into the early mound period in some regions, then set aside with care. Shrines on hilltops and in groves linked the work of the fields to the favor of the unseen. The local gods of water and harvest did not disappear when a new paramount clan took the stage. They were adopted. Priests and shrine keepers found their place in the new order, which tells you that the cleverness on display here was political as well as military. When you want to rule villages that have their own gods, it is wise to honor those gods and to add your ancestors to the company rather than to push them out. The written mirrors of China continue to reflect this change. They report that after Himiko died, a younger girl of her kin, often called Ayo or Toyo, took the throne and calmed the realm. They note later envoys, including an offer of titles for kings in the islands and a familiar complaint about unrest at the fringes. With each notice, the archipelago seems less a scattering of unrelated settlements and more a patchwork quilt with a visible seam near the Kinai. The effect is steady even if the accounts are brief. By the start of the 5th century, it looks to outside observers as if there is a single court that can at least pretend to speak for many. It helps here to stand on the rim of a mid-sized keyhole mound and look outward. You see the flat of a floodplain. You see low hills where timber crews brought logs and where haniwa were fired. You see smaller mounds in attendance like squires to a lord. Off beyond the fields, you see a line of raised floor buildings that must be storehouses, and by them the long halls where a chief received guests beneath beams blackened by smoke. A funeral here drew people for miles. The ground shook with the tramp of feet, and the thud of soil dropped from baskets as the mound rose like a slow wave. When it was done, the haniwa were set in tidy order, and the moat filled to a bright surface. The tomb was not a place of hiding. It was a public claim. Himiko's story is part history and part mirror trick. We know her because China wrote her down. We can sense her because later Japan remembered women of ritual power who stand at the head of lineages and who speak for the gods at shrines that still matter. We can locate her because mounds on a new scale appear when the text says she died. We cannot sign her death certificate or point to a single stone and say this exact one. That uncertainty is not a flaw. It is a reminder that early statehood is a negotiation more than a decree. Clans agree to be led because it solves more problems than it creates. Chiefs knit together distant valleys because rivers flow to the same sea and because harvest calendars do not care for local pride. A priestess queen lends even the quarrelsome the sense that the gods approve of the whole exercise. By the middle of the 3rd century, a political culture has taken shape that will dominate the next age. It is frank about rank. It is comfortable with monument. It reaches across the sea for prestige and sends back letters with seals. It buries its leaders in earthworks that order the horizon. It keeps the village gods and adds a radiance of its own around a central lineage. The archipelago does not yet have the legal codes and ministries of a continental court, but it is thinking in larger frames. The stage is set for the Yamato state to step forward and use both myth and mound to turn many small countries into one realm. Walk south from the old river flats of the Kinai Plain on a clear morning, and you begin to notice round hills that are not quite hills. Their slopes are faced with pale stones. A shallow moat gleams around them. From the air, some of these mounds look like an ancient key laid on a green cloth, a circle joined to a squared front by a narrow neck. They are tombs, and they tell you that something new has happened in Japan. Someone can command enough labor to move entire landscapes, pile earth higher than tree lines, and people the slopes with ranks of clay figures that watch the horizon forever. This is the world of early Yamato. It is the world of the Kofun, the old mounds, where authority is measured in the weight of a hill. The shift did not come from nowhere. By the later 3rd century, the rice fields of Yayoi country had multiplied and linked villages in long chains of ditches and obligations. Chiefs who could organize water and settle quarrels found it easier to call men to cut timber and to raise palisades. Trade in iron, mirrors, and glass beads made certain households glow. Out of this landscape of capable local leaders, a few lineages in the Kinai region began to stand taller than the rest. They married into neighboring clans, collected allies, and took the final step that separates the important from the ruling. They turned death into a proclamation. Build a mound so large that no one can miss it, and you have told the living exactly how the world is arranged. Archaeologists can read these mounds the way a librarian reads spines from across a room. The earliest keyhole tombs rise in the Nara Basin, soon after the time when the Chinese chroniclers note the death of the shaman queen Himiko. One famous candidate for that era is the Hashihaka Mound, long and poised among low hills, a work that seems to belong to a first generation of rulers who have learned that ceremony can be made from earth. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the tombs swell to astonishing size. The great mounds of the Mozu and Furuichi clusters near Osaka mark a city of the dead with avenues of water and earth that once required tens of thousands of hands. The Daisen Mound, attributed by later tradition to an emperor named Nintoku, stretches nearly 500 meters from end to end, with moats like causeways of sky around it. It is difficult to stand near such a thing and not feel that you are in the presence of a message. Open the ground inside one of these tombs, and the message continues in objects. The slope is often faced with fist-sized river stones that once gleamed white in the sun, a skin called fukishi. On the flanks stand haniwa, clay cylinders in tidy rows at first, later joined by figures that take human and animal form. There are haniwa of warriors with shields, of house fronts with tiled eaves, of chickens, boats, saddled horses, even musicians. They look less like toys than a small census of the world that has been arranged around the person within. Chambers lined with stone-holed, lacquered coffins. Mirrors of cast bronze lie ready to catch light that will never reach them. Swords rest by a hip and armor plates lie in ordered stacks. Curving Magatama beads form strings on chests and wrists. You can hear the economy in these goods. There are iron blades that speak of craftsmen and trade routes. There are mirrors that tell of ties with the continent. There are ornaments that mark rank so clearly that even 15 centuries later, you sense who would have spoken first in a council house. The mound itself was a project plan made dirt. First ditches were dug, and their spoil thrown inward to raise the first courses. Crews laid stone to hold the faces firm. Platforms were packed in courses like a stepped pyramid in clay. When the chamber had been built and the coffin and goods set within, earth was heaped to close the inner room, and the long final lifts of the mound went up, all with baskets and hand tools. Clay figures were planted in their rows. The moat was filled and levees trimmed. On the day of burial, the space around the mound would have been a city of the living. Villages emptied into processions. Drums and bells sounded. The dead chief or queen was carried in on a path strewn with reeds. Offerings were made. Oaths were given. A new leader took the seat on the viewing platform, and the crowd saw exactly where the line ran. The ability to do this made Yamato. That name, which first names a region, becomes a shorthand for the people who are able to command the work of many clans and to present themselves as the natural center of the islands. The early Yamato court did not look like a Chinese palace with rows of administrators in silk reciting law codes. It was a circle of strong kin groups called uji, bound by marriage, oath, and a sense that the gods had given them charge of the rice lands between the mountains and the sea. There were ranking titles that later ages remembered as kabane. Some clans are remembered as omi, some as muraji, each with duties and privileges. Around them were occupational groups called be that produced cloth, iron, timber, or ceremonial goods, and that were attached to noble houses as their economic backbone. The arrangement is both practical and theatrical. You need rice and iron to build and to guard, and you need stories to explain why this house and not that one receives envoys and sets up a new shrine. Horses arrive during this time, and with them a change in the tempo of war and travel. In tombs from the 5th century, one begins to find saddle plates, bits, and stirrups. The stirrup is the quiet revolution. A rider who can plant his feet can shoot a strong bow from a moving horse and stay in the saddle. That turns skirmishes that used to be close and on foot into contests where leaders can decide the day at a gallop. Mounted elites could move quickly between river valleys, watch over distant granaries, and appear on the ridges above rebellious neighbors with unnerving speed. If one asks how a single lineage in the Kinai could knit together wider territories, the answer rests in part on the steady stomp of hooves. Links across the sea tighten. From Korea come tools, armor patterns, stones for querns, ideas about how to lay out storehouses and halls, even skilled migrants who set up kilns and smithies. From the southern Chinese courts come letters and titles for men who call themselves kings of Wa. In the histories of the southern dynasties, there is a sequence known in Japan as the Five Kings of Wa. Over much of the 5th century, a line of Yamato rulers sent embassies seeking recognition and military titles that would raise their status both abroad and at home. The details are dusty, but the gist is vivid. A ruler who is saluted in a Chinese court can come home and show the seals and the silks, and ask his rivals to look again at who should lead the spring levy. One emblem of this international moment survives in a storied weapon, the 7-branched sword preserved at a shrine in Nara, whose inscription records a gift from a Korean king to a leader in the islands in the 4th century. Even if scholars argue about the precise reading, the blade as an object says that rank and gift moved across the straits with care. The court in the Kinai had to keep a careful balance with the peninsula. The kingdoms of Baekje, Silla, and Goguryeo maneuvered for advantage. The Japanese liked Baekje for its craftsmen and for the habit of polite words. Silla rose with energy and gathering strength further down the timeline. Yamato rulers sent forces or advisors to allied states and received envoys in return. Later, chroniclers wrote of a Japanese presence in a place they called Mimana on the southern Korean coast, a phrase that has stirred debate among modern scholars. What we can say without stepping into a quarrel is that the sea lanes were busy, that there were enclaves of merchants and specialists who spoke each other's languages, and that the political life of the archipelago could not be cut free from the politics of the peninsula. At home, the culture of the court deepened. Potters in this age began to fire a new high-temperature grey ware called su, turned on a wheel and baked in climbing kilns. Su-ware jars and dishes are spare and sturdy and spread quickly through elite households. Swords took on forms with ring-shaped pommels, and craftsmen who in Yayoi times would have made bells shifted their talents to gilt bronze ornaments and to fittings for harness and hilts. Shrines of great age gathered their form in these centuries. At Ise on the coast, where the sun goddess was honored, carpenters shaped cypress beams and thatched roofs in a style that made simplicity into a kind of perfection, and the practice of periodic rebuilding took hold as a way to keep the shrine forever new and forever old. At Izumo to the north, a tall shrine to a stormy deity kept a memory of older regional pride and was folded into the orbit of the rising court. Administration was still a matter of kin and oath rather than of neat registers and formal ministries, but order grew more regular. The court named provincial overseers in regions where allies held sway. It called distant clan leaders to seasonal gatherings where gifts were given and due respect exacted in return. It bestowed ranks that meant something more than flattery. Even the tombs reflect a developing grammar. Early mounds vary in size and proportion. Later ones settle into patterns for a generation, then move to new patterns as if an unwritten manual had been revised. Where a mound sits in relation to a river bend or a hill crest, which face of the keyhole points toward a sacred site or a route, how many rings of water circle the base, these choices were not left to chance. The countryside became a gallery of statements with a script that those alive could read. The presence of Haniwa is one of the most human touches of the age. The earliest are simple cylinders that probably marked boundaries or terraces. Soon there are soldiers with wide belts and straight backs, musicians with drums, women with textured hair and layered clothing, horses in simple tack, and houses that look like architects' models. They were set in lines and clusters along mound edges and on platforms. Many have a tranquil, almost watchful expression that makes them feel like part of the ceremonial staff. Later writers spoke of tomb servants in earlier times. The Haniwa feel like their clay successors, tokens of a retinue that remains on duty. We have only scattered written clues from within Japan itself during this period, mostly later copies of earlier lists and a few inscriptions that survived on stone and metal. Even so, the outline is strong. A Yamato line coalesced in the Kinai. It harnessed surplus through a network of allied clans and attached workers. It made law in the old way, by placing the right people in the right places, and by telling stories that convinced the rest that this arrangement was blessed by the gods. It projected that story in earthworks and in processions, and in the daily business of who sat where and who spoke first. It did not yet write histories of its own, but it did not live in silence. China wrote the archipelago into its books. Korea sent gifts and asked aid. The mounds wrote on the land in a script of water and clay. Stand at the edge of one of the mid-sized keyhole tombs at Furuichi in the late afternoon, and you can see how this worked. On one side, a village goes about its business among fields laid into squares by canals. On another side, a line of trees shades a road where pack horses walk toward a storeyard. Across the moat, a slope of stones rises to a level terrace, and above that, the round back of the mound fills the sky. A row of Haniwa figures keeps its place, though the centuries have taken their paint and polish. Everything in view is made by the same community. The rice that fills the jar, the iron that cuts the stalk, the hands that dress the dead, and the earth that is heaped over him are parts of the same economy and the same belief. This is what early Yamato learned to organize and to present. By the later 5th century and into the 6th, the state that began as a circle of assertive clans has become something like a court. A handful of family names carry familiar offices. The largest mounds begin to shrink as rulers turn their attention from proclaiming rank in death to managing rank among the living. Envoys still cross the sea, but now there is talk of new faith and new learning. The tools are in place for a leap that will change everything. Writing will take hold. Buddhism will arrive with monks and texts, and an art that travels with faith. The story will move from earthworks to temples, and from Haniwa to wooden halls that glow with gold, leaf, and lacquer. If you arrived at a Yamato court gathering in the early 7th century, you would notice something new among the lacquered trays and the polite bows. A small bronze image of a serene figure sits on a stand, hands arranged in a calm gesture, the folds of his robe falling in measured lines. There is incense. There is the murmur of sutra recitation in a language no one here grew up speaking. The courtiers still exchange poems, and the local gods are still honored at their shrines. But another current has entered the room. That current is Buddhism, and it carries with it books, images, ritual, architecture, and a style of thought that will change how the court understands itself. The story of arrival is told twice in the old histories, and the two tellings disagree politely over the date. One tradition says that a king of Baekje in the peninsula sent a gilt bronze Buddha, sutra scrolls, and a letter to the Yamato court in the year we count as 538. Another account places the gift in 552. Either way, the package crossed the straits with monks and artisans, and it caused a stir. Some families at court were entranced by the beauty of the image and the dignity of the scriptures. Others warned that foreign gods might anger the native deities who guarded the harvest and the throne. The most enthusiastic patrons were the Soga, a powerful lineage with a taste for continental learning. Arrayed against them were the Mononobe and the Nakatomi, who managed traditional rites and were wary of a new cult that came with unfamiliar books and strange words. For a time, the Buddha moved from house to house like a contested guest. When plague or crop failure came, opponents said that the foreign icon had offended the old gods. Temples that had been started were dismantled. When peace returned and the Soga gained advantage, new halls were raised. The quarrel reached a climax late in the 6th century, when Soga no Umako defeated Mononobe no Moriya in battle near Mount Shigi. The victory cleared the way for lasting patronage. A temple called Asuka-dera rose soon after in the Soga's home country. There, a large bronze image known today as the Asuka Great Buddha took its place, likely cast by a craftsman remembered as Tori, whose style showed a fine awareness of Northern Wei Chinese sculpture. It was the first time an image on that scale sat in a Japanese hall, and it brought with it a sense that this new faith could be as grand as any rite the islands had yet seen. The turning of fashion into policy belongs to a single remarkable figure. He is known to us as Prince Shotoku. He was born in 574, served as regent to his aunt Empress Suiko from 592, and died in 622. In those years, he gave Japan a template for statecraft that drew from Chinese models but spoke in a Japanese voice. He supported temples and monks with a seriousness that silenced many doubters. He is credited with founding Shitenno-ji in Osaka, which honored the 4 heavenly kings, protectors of the Buddhist realm. He sponsored Horyu-ji at Ikaruga, a sprawling complex with a 5-storied pagoda and a golden hall, begun in 607, rebuilt after a later fire, and revered today as one of the oldest wooden temple complexes anywhere. He invited sculptors and roof tilers and carpenters to find work in service of a new architectural language that would soon be as familiar in the Yamato Plain as the old keyhole mounds. Yet it was on paper and in protocol that Shotoku's hand fell most strongly. He introduced a cap and rank system in 603 that used colored headgear to mark merit and service rather than only birth. It was not a pure meritocracy, and noble families still occupied the best seats, but the idea that offices could be graded and awarded according to ability was a new and useful fiction that made administration more predictable. In the next year, he issued what we call the 17-article Constitution of 604. The word constitution can mislead. It was not a legal code in the Roman sense. It was a set of guiding principles, a moral and political mirror for officials. It opened with a call for harmony, which meant peace between factions at court. It told ministers to obey the sovereign and urged them to consult one another before acting. It praised the triple jewel of Buddhism as a source of truth and urged reverence for the law. It asked for proper rewards for merit and warned against private grudges in public matters. The tone is earnest and thorough. You can hear a man who has read widely in Chinese statecraft, who knows how unruly his nobles can be, and who wants to tie them to a few shared virtues. Diplomacy became a stage for this new confidence. In 607, and again in 608, envoys sailed to the Sui court in China. One of the letters is famous for the line that angered the Chinese emperor and delighted later Japanese readers. It called the sender the Son of Heaven in the land where the sun rises, and addressed the Chinese ruler as the Son of Heaven in the land where the sun sets. It was a neat bit of equalization and an early example of Japan wording its status in a way that took Chinese forms but refused a subordinate place. The missions brought back books, calendrical knowledge, Buddhist images, physicians, and the sense that a well-ordered court should have ministries, registers, and tests of ability. The government school in the capital taught the classics. Monks copied sutras. Alchemists and court astronomers learned to mark auspicious days. A state that had written little now began to write as a matter of routine. These changes did not sweep away the old world. Shinto priests kept their shrines in order. The Aiz complex honoring the sun goddess maintained its timber rhythms and periodic rebuilding. The court cultivated a sunny approach to religious balance. When a great temple was raised, it was often placed under the notional protection of a nearby kami. That habit of seeing the Buddhas and the local gods as partners rather than rivals produced a blended practice that would last for centuries. The high god Hachiman, for example, would in time be honored as a protector of the Buddhist law. The two traditions touched at 100 points, and the line between them blurred on purpose. The arrival of Buddhist art remade the look of power. The old haniwa that stood on tomb slopes gave way to pagodas and image halls. The court invited painters to gild wooden statues with gold leaf and to lay pigments over plaster walls. Roofs took on heavy tiles that clicked in the wind and cast neat shadows on the courtyard stones. Reliefs on temple bells told stories of donors and storms averted. The shapes of roofs and the distances between pillars began to carry meaning, as clear to a monk as a rank sash was to a minister. It was a new language written in wood and clay. To walk through Horyuji or Asukadera in these years was to feel that a literate and pictorial civilization had rooted itself among the paddy fields. Shotoku also understood the value of example. Chronicles credit him with writing commentaries on 3 sutras and with promoting a simple ethic of kindness and diligence for rulers. Whether the pages we have today are his hand, or the work of admiring students, matters less than the tradition that they convey. The regent of a frontier court presented himself as a reader of serious texts. That image mattered in a world where Chinese emperors prided themselves on scholarship. It mattered at home as well. A minister who knew how to read Buddhist teachings and Confucian advice could advise the throne with more than instinct and family precedent. The force of all this learning would soon push events beyond Shotoku's lifetime. When he and Empress Suiko were gone, the old jealousies at court returned with a vengeance. In 645, Prince Naka no O, who would later become Emperor Tenji, and his ally Nakatomi no Kamatari struck down Soga no Iruka in the palace in a sudden and bloody purge. The act broke the Soga dominance and opened the way to a set of sweeping edicts known as the Great Reform. The Taika reforms that followed claimed to place all land under the emperor, reorganized provinces under appointed governors, announced plans for household registers and tax quotas, and called for a planned capital city built to a grid. The documents echo Chinese codes and the hand of men who had read them closely. What Prince Shotoku had framed as virtues and aspirations was now stated as policy and administrative law. The court that once ruled by kin and mound was learning to rule by office and paper. It is worth pausing to look at a single temple precinct to see how much had changed in a short time. Take Horyuji again, not only for its age but for its clarity. You walk through a south gate into a walled rectangle. To the right, a 5-storied pagoda rises from a stone base, its finial lifted against a clear Nara sky. To the left sits the golden hall with its bracketed eaves, inside which stand images of the Buddha and attendant bodhisattvas. The air smells of cypress and old lacquer. Monks move in quiet routines from hall to lecture room to dormitory. A bell sounds the hour. Outside the wall, farmers move along ditches with shoulder poles. The line between sacred and ordinary life is a mud path and a whitewashed wall. Yet the presence of this place changes the rhythm of the village. There are markets at festival days. There are pilgrims with stories from other provinces. There are scribes who can write a contract and doctors who have taken a few lessons from Chinese texts. To live near a temple is to live near a new kind of order. Buddhism also offered the court a more abstract kind of legitimacy. The old claim that the imperial line descended from the sun goddess did not lose its force. It gained companions. A ruler could now say that he governed according to the law of the Buddha, that he supported charitable works, that he protected the monkhood, and that he saw himself as a wheel-turning king who brought order to the world. Ideas from Indian and Chinese political thought gave the throne a vocabulary for justice and welfare that did not rely only on ancestor stories. The balance is striking. On one day, the emperor could visit Ise and receive the blessing of Amaterasu in a rite of deep antiquity. On another, he could preside at the dedication of a sutra repository and speak of compassion. The two gestures pointed to the same end. A country knit together by belief and by roads is easier to govern. Writing underpinned all of this. The court adopted Chinese characters and began to maintain records with a care that would have amazed a Yamato leader of a century before. With writing came calendars and era names, taxation tables, registers of free farmers, and orders for provincial temple building. With writing also came literature. The earliest stories and poems that would later flower in Nara and Heian needed this groundwork. The habit of setting down a thought with a brush changed how people remembered and argued. It gave ministers a way to say what they had done and why. And it gave their rivals a way to say that they had done it badly. In a few generations, the islands passed from mounds that speak in earth to documents that speak in ink. Stand at the edge of an asker field in the late afternoon after the irrigation gates have been closed. There is the smell of wet soil and straw. In the distance, the tiled roof of a temple catches the sun and flashes like a fish turning in a current. Behind you, the low swell of an old mound reminds you that authority once sat in stone-lined chambers below ground. Before you, the eaves and pagoda lines point upward. The court is learning to make its claims in new materials, to imagine its future in wooden halls, painted images, and ranked offices. The people do the same work they have always done. Only now there are new holidays, new songs, and new kinds of visitors on the road. The change feels steady rather than sudden. It carries you from the quiet rooms of Prince Shotoku to a capital city that is about to be planned on a broad plain with straight streets and temples that will outshine anything yet seen. Picture a broad plain ringed by low blue hills. A wide north-south avenue runs like a plumb line across the fields. At its northern end stands a palace with crimson pillars and white plaster walls. On either side of the avenue, the land is ruled into tidy rectangles of streets and wards. This is Heijo-kyo, founded in the year 710, the first fully planned capital of Japan. It was built on the Yamato Plain to be a stage for government and a workshop for a new kind of civilization. Heijo-kyo was not guessed at with lanes that wandered as the years allowed. It was measured and set like a carpenter's square. The planners borrowed the idea of a grid from the great Chinese capitals and then made it their own. The main avenue, called Suzaku, ran straight to the southern gate of the palace. East and west markets sat in balanced places so that merchants and tax agents could find each other without fuss. Inside the palace precinct, the great audience hall faced south toward the city. On ceremony days, the hall held the emperor on a raised dais with ministers below, ranks stiff with colored caps and formal robes. This was politics as choreography, and the building itself told everyone where to stand and when to bow. Behind the show lay a dense new order. Over the previous generation, Yamato leaders had been writing down how they wanted the country to work. The Taiho Code of 701 and the Euro Code of 718 gathered Chinese legal ideas and Japanese practice into a system of ministries, ranks, courts, and provincial administration. Land was to be registered and allotted to households. Taxes were to be paid in rice and cloth and labor. Provinces were mapped and given governors who answered to the capital, and below them districts had headmen who counted people and fields. Roads were improved and lined with postal stations where official messengers could rest and change horses. We still remember this as the Ritsuryo order, law and regulation made into a framework for a whole archipelago. Coins began to ring in purses. In 708, the court minted the first official copper coin called Wado Kaichin, a proud thing based on Tang models. Empress Genmei, whose reign saw the founding of Nara, liked order and permanence, and a coin with a neat legend promised both. In practice, many people still preferred to trade rice and cloth, but the wish to count value in metal was now on the table, and more issues followed in the 8th century. If you walked through the markets on a summer day, you would have heard the voices of vendors who were learning how to haggle in both weights of grain and stacks of cash. What set Nara apart from anything that had come before was the scale of religious patronage. Buddhism had already arrived in Asker with images and modest halls. In Nara, it flowered into an urban forest of temples that shaped the skyline and the way people thought about the state. Two great foundations stood near the palace as pillars of influence. Kofuku-ji was the Fujiwara family temple, a sign that the most powerful clan expected to mix piety with politics. Yakushi-ji honored the medicine Buddha and became a center for learning and sculpture. Horyu-ji, a little to the south in Old Asker country, remained a revered elder among these newcomers, a reminder of the days of Prince Shotoku. The air around the capital filled with the ring of bronze bells, the scent of incense, and the murmur of monks chanting in halls with tiled roofs that flashed after rain. The most ambitious project of all rose under Emperor Shomu, who reigned in the middle of the century. A harsh smallpox epidemic had rolled through the islands in the 732nd and early 742nd, leaving villages empty and fields weedy. Shomu answered with a vow that the whole nation would be knit together under the protection of the Buddha. In 741, he ordered a system of provincial temples, one for monks and one for nuns, to stand in every province. Their role was as much social as spiritual. They gave the countryside a shared calendar of prayers and festivals. They taught basic letters and medicine where they could. At the center of this system stood Todaiji in Nara, with a world within its walls and a goal that almost defied sense. Inside the great precinct of Todaiji, the court raised the Daibutsudan, the great Buddha hall, to house a single image of Vairocana, the cosmic Buddha. The statue itself was cast in bronze and gilded, a seated figure about 15 meters high. The amount of copper and tin needed for such a work was enormous. The court sent orders across the land for copper from distant mines and charcoal from every wooded valley. The monk Gyoki, a gifted organizer, toured the provinces and rallied donations, a kind of national subscription that made ordinary people feel they had a hand in the effort. In 752, after years of casting and patching and gilding, the statue was dedicated with a ceremony that drew envoys and monks from as far as China and India. It was said that the head of the high priest lightly touched the eyes of the Buddha with a brush to open them to the world. A Shinto god was invited to protect the work as well, an elegant step that told everyone there was no quarrel between the old gods and the new law. Todaiji and its great Buddha became a symbol that the state could be both pious and grand, a nation gathered in one image. Next to Todaiji, the court kept a treasure house called the Shosuin. It is a long storehouse built in a simple log style, but the objects inside are a poem to the reach of the Silk Road. There are glass cups from the far west, a lute shaped like those played in Persia, brocades with foreign patterns, carved rhinoceros, horn, and delicate cosmetics boxes. The Nara court did not sail to Samarkand, but the world came to its door by many hands. When you stand in the Shosuin today, you see how ideas and goods traveled to the edge of the ocean and were made part of the fabric of a Japanese city. Literature found its own voice in Nara. The court finished the Kojiki in 712 and the Nihon Shoki in 720, sweeping from divine beginnings to recent reigns, creating a past that explained the present. At the same time, officials were ordered to compile provincial gazetteers, the Fudoki, which collected local myths, place names, and resources. Some survive, and they read like a country survey with the occasional dragon in the margins. Most precious of all is the Manyoshu, a great anthology of poems gathered by the later 8th century. It holds love songs, laments, travel verses, and odes to the moon and the plum blossom. Names like Kakinomoto no Hitomaro and Otomo no Yakamochi live in its pages. The voice of a guard at a frontier post who misses his wife sits next to a courtier's smooth lines, and the mix gives the book a life that still moves readers. Nara taught the court how to make laws, but it also taught the language how to sing. Daily life in the capital was busy, practical, and more international than one might expect. The city had guilds of carpenters and oil sellers, scribes who rented their brushes by the line, and stall keepers who sold dumplings hot enough to scald your tongue. Kentoshi missions to Tang China came and went with the seasons, carrying students and monks who wanted to see the great monasteries and the libraries across the water. Some stayed for years. The monk Gunjin tried to cross several times and was blown back by storms or blocked by officials until at last, blind from hardship, he reached Nara in 753 and founded Toshodaiji to teach the rules of monastic discipline. Kibi no Makibi returned with books and music and a head full of new ideas. Abe no Nakamaro did so well at the Tang court that he served as an official there and wrote sad poems about the moon seen from a foreign land. Back home, Gagaku court music absorbed Chinese and Korean instruments and settled into stately forms that still sound in palace halls. The capital was a place where a farmer from Yamato could hear a tune born beyond the desert, set to a Japanese rhythm. None of this was cheap. The Ritsuryo state needed rice and labor from the countryside to build halls and pave roads. The equal field system that allotted paddy to free farmers and took a set share in tax worked on parchment, but less well on the ground. Over time, noble families and big temples were granted tax exemptions and began to gather private estates called shun. A farmer who found life easier on a protected estate drifted into the orbit of that patron. The census grew less accurate. The tax base thinned. These are dry facts on paper, but they mattered in kitchens and barns. They explain why later emperors looked for fresh starts and new capitals, and why the tidy logic of the codes was already fraying at the edges before the century was out. Power had its hazards inside the walls as well. The Fujiwara rose in influence as masters of court politics and patrons of Kofukuji. In the 762nd, a gifted monk named Dokyo became close to Empress Shotoku and rose with remarkable speed. An oracle from a distant shrine was said to hint that he should sit on the throne itself. The court balked. The mythic lineage of the sun goddess could accommodate many things, but not a monk in the imperial chair. The empress died in 770, and Dokyo was sent away. The lesson was clear. The court needed temples, but it did not want them deciding who would rule. The man who learned that lesson most fully was Emperor Kanmu, a strong figure who would later choose to leave Nara behind. For now, stand in the city at its height and look around. To the east, a line of low mountains holds green even in winter. The palace compounds stretch in measured rectangles, their gates painted in a red so bright it looks almost wet. The West Market clatters with mule hooves, and the good-natured shouting that comes when a fishmonger and a housekeeper finally agree on a price. In the distance, the roof of Todaiji rises like a long wave. If a bell sounds from a temple at dusk, it rolls across the wards and makes the lungs of the whole city breathe in time. At Kasuga Shrine, established in 768 as the Fujiwara family shrine, deer wander the groves with the entitled air of sacred messengers and nibble whatever looks interesting on a visitor's sleeve. The feel is both ceremonial and human. The city was built to impress foreign envoys and provincial governors. It was also built so that people who sold sandals and baked cakes could find their way home. By the 782nd, the capital felt crowded and entangled with its own clergy and families. The court had achieved its dream of a permanent seat and learned the costs that came with it. Emperor Kanmu judged that a move would restore vigor and reduce meddling. The first step would be to a fresh site at Nagaoka. and then to a broad basin a little farther north that would take the hopeful name Heian-kyo. But to leave Nara was not to forget it. The grid, the ministries, the poetry, the coin, the great Buddha that caught the sun when the clouds broke after rain, all these would travel in the minds and habits of the court to the next city. Step into a Nara ward at first light, and you hear the city wake in layers. A watchman slides open a gate that has held the night outside. A bell sounds from a temple courtyard and ripples across tiled roofs. A cart rattles toward the West Market, with baskets of greens still wet from the morning. In the palace, compound clerks unroll bundles of bamboo and wood tablets, check yesterday's tallies, and sharpen their brushes. The city is a grid, and the day keeps to it. Life in Nara worked because thousands of ordinary tasks lined up behind the grand ideas. The law codes had promised a country audited by written records, and the capital made that promise visible. Officials filed reports on narrow wooden slips called mokon, which archaeologists now find in palace drains and storage pits with ink still legible. They list shipments of rice from distant provinces, strings of coins checked and resealed, lengths of cloth levied as tax, even the names of horses sent to a relay station. A single morning's work in the Ministry of Popular Affairs might mean verifying who owes what labor days this quarter, assigning a provincial corvée team to help rebuild a bridge, and sending a note to the market office about a merchant who has been shaving weights. It is not glamorous, but it is how a legal order becomes real. Most people did not live in palaces. They lived in wooden houses with packed earth floors and deep eaves that cast a shade you can still feel on your skin when you walk an old street in summer. A common meal was rice if you were lucky, millet if you were not, salted fish or river eel, pickled greens, and soup thickened with a mash of beans. Fermented seasonings were already part of the kitchen. People brewed sake, made bean pastes, and learned how to coax flavor from thyme and microbes. Markets sold oil for lamps, salt from coastal pans, combs and needles and twine, and ink cakes that left black stains on the fingers of schoolboys at provincial academies. There were bathhouses near temples and public wells at street corners. Fires were a constant threat, so blocks kept big water jars ready, and neighbors knew who would form the bucket line. Clothes told you rank at a glance. The cap and rank rules that began in Asker were refined in Nara and assigned colors and trims that signaled grade and office. A senior official could be seen at a distance by the dye of his robes and the sheen of his sash ornaments. Temple artisans dressed for work in short jackets and tied trousers. Farmers arriving from the provinces wore hemp that had been washed and beaten soft. Silk appeared on festival days, or in the precincts of the palace and great temples. The city had dyers and weavers and leather workers and tile makers, all of whom served the monumental appetite of the capital for anything that could be shaped and set. The religious city within the city never slept. Monks in the 6 Nara schools argued fine points of doctrine in lecture halls. At Todaiji, the Kegon school taught a vision of a universe where all things interpenetrate like jewels in a net. At Toshodaiji, the great monk Ganjin, blind from the storms of his many attempts to reach Japan, taught monastic discipline with a firmness that finally gave the islands a settled rule for ordination. Other schools studied the nature of perception, the emptiness of categories, or the catalogue of elements that make up existence. These were not only abstractions. They trained minds that kept records, healed the sick, and advised the court on how to make a vow that would hold. Shinto moved in its own circles and often met Buddhism at a shrine gate without friction. At Kasuga Shrine, the deer wandered among lanterns as if they owned the place because, in a way, they did. They were seen as messengers and behaved like them, curious and bold. The court invited the god Hachiman from Kyushu to act as a protector of the Great Buddha Project, an elegant way of saying that old and new guardians were colleagues. Festivals marked the year, and the Shuni rites at Nigatsu-do in the Todaiji complex began in the 8th century with night fires and water drawing that still fill the dark with a stirring glow. The calendar hummed with days when you purify yourself, days when you avoid travel, days when the monks chant through the night for a good harvest and calm seas. Education had a clear place. The State Academy trained sons of the nobility in Chinese classics, history, and law. Provincial capitals ran schools for the sons of local elites so that governors would have clerks who could write a competent order and read a report without guessing at the characters. Some priests taught writing to commoners who worked around temple complexes. That is how a carpenter learns to read a plan, and a steward learns to keep a tidy list of rents. Literacy was still limited, but it touched more lives than one might expect. The roads that threaded the capital to the rest of the archipelago were more than dirt tracks. The government maintained relay stations at set intervals, where a messenger could get a fresh horse and a meal, and could sleep on a clean mat before pushing on to the next one. The system linked Heijo-kyo to Dazaifu in Kyushu, which served as the western administrative hub and the window to routes from the continent. It was from Dazaifu that news of a distant storm or a ship from Silla might come first. Guard units called Sakemori from the eastern provinces rotated to stations on the Kyushu coast, and some of them sent poems home that found their way into the Manyoshu, those spare lines about missing a familiar hill or crying at the sight of a plum tree in a foreign spring. The Manyoshu itself is one of the best windows into life beyond policy. It preserves not only courtly verse, but the voices of soldiers, minor officials, and women whose names are otherwise lost. A guard writes from a fort that the moon looks the same over Kyushu as it did over his village, and that is both comfort and ache. A widow grieves with a clarity that makes the centuries fall away. A princess writes about the scent of plum and the embarrassment of a sleeve soaked by unexpected rain. The anthology shows how a city that had adopted Chinese characters made them do Japanese work, fitting sound to shape and beginning the long process that would lead to kana syllabaries and a literature that spoke in its own rhythms. Commerce in Nara had both a local and a global scale. In the east and west markets, a housekeeper bargained for a fish, while a trader from a provincial port sold woven mats and salt. At the same time, objects from very far away were present in the capital in ways that still surprise. The Shosoin storehouse next to Todaiji kept the gifts and regalia of Emperor Shomu and the Empress, and it became a time capsule by happy accident. Inside are cut glass cups that gleam with patterns common in the lands of Persia, musical instruments whose shapes were learned from Central Asia, and printed textiles that look like they traveled by many hands along the Silk Road to find a final rest in a Japanese storehouse. The treasures tell a simple truth. Nara may sit in a farming plain between hills, but its mind roamed from India to the desert and back. For all its grace, the city strained. The Richiryo state assumed that every 6 years the government could reassign rice fields to households, and that all adult men would owe a measured share of rice tax, cloth tax, and labor days on public works. On paper, the system balanced neatly. In the field, the river broke a levee and silt buried allotment markers. A winter fever left a household short of hands. A temple claimed exemption for a stretch of paddies, and a noble family added another estate to its protection and stopped reporting it. The equal field ideal gave way to shun estates, where patrons offered security in exchange for loyalty and a share. That drift began in Nara. It would reshape landholding for centuries to come. The city also discovered the costs of success in religion. The court needed temples as schools, hospitals, and moral anchors. It did not need abbots telling emperors what to do. The Dokyo affair in the 760 seconds showed how close the line could be. A charismatic monk reached for political power through influence at the top. The court pushed back hard and removed him when it had the chance. Emperor Kanmu learned from that tangle and decided that a clean slate would help. The solution would be a new capital and a deliberate step away from the temple density of Nara. None of that diminishes what Nara achieved. It set the habit of a capital that looks like a capital. It made a bureaucracy that, for all its flaws, could count and build and move. It turned Buddhism from a curiosity into an armature for civic life, and did so without turning its back on the older shrines. It minted coins and saw how money might help and how it might not. It sent students and monks across a difficult sea and welcomed them home with new skills and books. It created a literature with a public voice and a private one, and taught the court to listen to both. Stand at sunset on the edge of the palace site today, and you can still feel the plan under your feet. The main avenue runs straight toward where the audience hall once stood. To the east, the low mountains gather their color. If you walk to Todaiji at dusk, you will hear the bell roll out across the city like a slow wave. The deer in the Kasuga woods will be nosing among the lanterns for any last treat a visitor forgot to guard. What Nara left is a way of arranging space and time so that a country can see itself. The next capital would take that arrangement and polish it into a long golden age. The new capital began with a walk in a field and a set of careful lines in the dirt. Emperor Kanmu wanted a fresh start after the crowded brilliance of Nara. Temples had become powerful neighbors. Family factions had their roots in every ward. The paperwork groaned. In 784, he tried a move to Nagaoka-kyo and found the place unlucky and unhelpful. Floods came, quarrels followed, and a murder did not improve the view. So surveyors went north to a broad basin where rivers ran clear and low hills leaned close without pressing. There they marked out a rectangle and drew a straight road that would carry the eye to a palace gate. In 794, the court marched in under bright banners. The new name was Heian-kyo, peace and tranquility. It was a prayer written as a postal address. Heian-kyo was a city made with a carpenter's square and a poet's ear. The main avenue, Suzaku, ran straight to the southern face of the palace. A great gate stood there, heavy and grand, a promise that order would hold. Markets sat to east and west so that trade would be balanced like a scale. Wards were numbered and streets were named, which meant a letter could find a door and a clerk could locate a tax debtor without asking every neighbor. Inside the palace, a broad audience hall faced south toward the city, and on ceremony days, the emperor sat on a tall dais, while ministers in colored caps stood below in ranked rows. The old mound builders had written authority in earth. Here it was spelled in wood and tile and choreography. Kanmu wanted more than scenery. He had read the lesson of Nara, and he did not plan to let temples steer policy. He also had a frontier to think about. In the northeast, the Amishi people still held valleys and forests beyond the reach of easy tax and road. Armies marched, stockades rose, and a general named Sakanue no Tamuramaro led campaigns that pushed the border forward. He received the title Sei Taishogun in 797, a mouthful that meant general who subdues barbarians. It was an old honor freshly used, and it would echo later in the country's history. The point at the time was simple. The court that laid out Heian liked good lines and proper rights, but it could also send men with bows and strong horses to the other end of the islands and keep them there through winter. Religion did not retire, it simply moved to the hills and learned new ways. Two men gave the Heian age its spiritual architecture. Saicho traveled to China, climbed to the mountain temples of Tiantai, and brought back a vision of the Lotus Sutra as a path for all. He set his base on Mount Hiei above the new capital, founded Enryaku-ji, and won imperial favor for a monkhood that studied hard and kept to discipline. Kukai went farther and read deeper in the dense rites of esoteric Buddhism. He returned with mantras and mandalas, with a taste for grand ritual, and with a calligrapher's hand so elegant that people later said the gods guided his brush. He found a home at Toji within the city and built a mountain monastery on the high plateau of Koya. Between them, a new balance took shape. Heian had a court of ministers and a court of monks, and the two courts learned to salute each other without tripping. The city grew a mind as well as a map. In 805 and 806, the new teachings took root. In 810, the court weathered a palace coup and emerged with a stronger sense of rules and ranks. The legal code, which had begun as an import from Tang China, settled into local use. Ministries kept registers, appointed governors to provinces, and counted fields with a diligence that was impressive on paper and sometimes patchy in the mud. The equal field system still aimed to allot rice land to households and to collect a tidy share. But private estates called shoen began to spread as temples, and great families gained exemptions and gathered dependents. The shift was slow and steady. It would shape politics for centuries. Heian Kyo worked because it learned how to mix correctness with grace. In the palace quarter, a new style of noble house appeared. Shinden mansions set their main halls on pillars above raked white gravel, open to gardens with ponds and islands, and framed views with galleries and screens. You walked through shafts of light and shadow that changed by the hour. Carp moved in slow circles where the roofline dipped into water. A covered bridge joined one pavilion to another so that a lady could cross without stepping into sun. The plan was a diagram of season and rank made into wood and water. Art answered the architecture. Painters worked in a native style called Yamato-e that had clarity and color suited to the climate and the light. Scenes of seasons and tales were laid on folding screens so that a room could carry a mountain pass in winter or a bridge over an evening river. Calligraphers made the written word into a performance. A letter was a work of art as much as a message. The choice of paper mattered, the weight of the brush mattered, and even the fragrance mattered, since the sheet might be scented and folded with a sprig of grass that named the month. Language itself changed in Heian. Chinese characters remained the script of office and law, but courtiers and court ladies distilled two phonetic scripts from the larger system. Katakana began as a set of neat notes in the margins of sutras. Hiragana flowed in loops and curves that suited poetry and diaries. With those scripts, the language could speak in its own music. The earliest great collection of poems in the New Age, the Kokin Wakashu, was compiled in 905 and included a preface that explained what a poem should do. It should take the heart by surprise and lay a small truth before it. From then on, a person at court needed to be able to answer a verse with a verse, to read the weather of a room from a rhyme, and to understand that a branch of plum or a mention of an autumn moon could carry an opinion as clear as a shouted speech. Music and ritual filled the calendar. Gagaku, the elegant music of the court, blended instruments and melodies from China and Korea into a stately repertoire that could turn a courtyard into a floating world. Sumo bouts at court mixed entertainment with offerings to keep the gods amused and the realm calm. On Maido, the court science of yin and yang and the 5 phases guided the choice of days for ceremonies and house building. An onmyoji named Abe no Seimei became a quiet authority, consulted about which street a bride should avoid and which night an emperor should not begin a journey. The city was planned with geomancy in mind. The Kamo shrines to the north were guardians as well as neighbors, and their great festival sent ox carts and riders down the straight avenues each spring in a procession that looked as old as the hills after only a few decades. Diplomacy changed course. In 894, the court cancelled official missions to China. The Tang dynasty had troubles of its own, and the sea crossing was costly and often unkind. Scholars led by Sugawara no Michizan argued that Japan had learned enough abroad and should now polish what it had. That decision did not close the door. private trade continued. Books, medicines, and new styles still arrived. But the court turned its gaze inward, and the culture that followed took a decidedly local shape. It is one of the reasons that the Heian Age looks and feels so Japanese in later memory. The forms matured without the hurry of constant comparison. Politics developed its own internal weather. The Fujiwara family grew adroit at placing daughters in the imperial line and stepped forward as regents when emperors were young. By the middle of the 10th century, they held a near monopoly on influence at court. Their temples, Kofukuji in particular, stood as public proof that wealth and piety could live in the same household without embarrassment. Their estates multiplied, their houses grew, and their poetry circles set the standard for taste. The emperor remained sacred and central. The Fujiwara learned to stand close and to speak softly in the right ear. Daily life in Heian-kyo had the rhythm of a city that knew how to be beautiful without forgetting that roofs leak in the rain. Carpenters mended tiles before the long summer storms arrived. Oil sellers carried sloshing jars down back lanes at dusk. In the markets, a housekeeper haggled over river fish, while a porter walked past with a frame of potted irises for a noble garden. At night, the city glowed at low light from paper lanterns. You could hear a court flute practicing a hard run in the distance and a dog complaining at a gate that refused to open. The countryside did not vanish. It came to the capital, and the capital sent itself back out along the roads. Provincial governors arrived with gifts and grievances, stayed long enough to learn the new steps, and returned to districts where the law was what the governor could enforce. In those districts, the Shoin estate took shape as a practical answer to a tug-of-war between lists and reality. A great family or a temple offered protection from taxes in exchange for loyalty and a share. Fields under that umbrella remained productive through bad years and good. In the short run, everyone won. In the long run, those umbrellas grew into a canopy that would keep the sun of central government from reaching the ground. The court loved polish. It also loved small, precise feelings. A taste took root that later generations named mono no aware, a tender awareness that things pass. It sounds abstract. It is not. It means that the sight of the first cherry blossoms can make a grown courtier cry without shame. It means that a girl smelling smoke in her hair after an evening beside a brazier can write a diary sentence that will still move readers 1,000 years later. It means that the light on a tiled roof after a storm is as worthy of notice as a birthday of a prince. This is the splendor of Heian, as much as silk robes and formal ranks. Stand for a moment by the Kamo River on a spring morning. The air is cold enough to sting a little. Herons lift out of the reeds because someone laughed too loud on the bank. Up the slope, the long line of the palace wall glows in the early sun. Behind it, a clerk is already grinding his ink, and a lady is already choosing which robe layers match the week. A messenger on a sorrel horse turns from the main avenue toward the East Market, with a letter tied under his sleeve. The city is awake, and somewhere in a quiet room, a young woman is devising a story about a shining prince who will change the way her country understands itself. That is for later, near the year 1000. For now, the city is set, the manners are written, the faiths have found their places. The Fujiwara are trimming their hedges and their ambitions. The roads are in good shape. The stage is built for a golden age. Step into Heian-kyo around the year 1000, and the first thing you notice is how deliberate everything feels. Streets meet at right angles. Canals keep their manners. Even the shadows under the palace eaves fall in tidy rectangles. The city has learned to move in time with its own sense of grace, and that grace reaches its fullest voice in the world that later readers know through a long tale about a shining prince. The tale is fiction, but the life it reveals is not. It is the record of a society that decided beauty and ceremony were not luxuries but a method for getting through the day. Begin in a noble house laid out in the Shinden style. The main hall faces a garden with a pond and small islands. Covered walkways cross the water, so robes need not drag in damp grass. Sliding doors and reed blinds control what can be seen and by whom. Rooms open not to corridors, but to views. A breeze moves through with the scent of plum or pine resin, depending on the month. Somewhere, a zither is being tuned for the third time, because it must be exactly right before anyone plucks a string. This is architecture that expects people to pay attention. And in Heian, attention was the central civic virtue. Clothes carried half of that attention. Women of the court dressed in layered robes called 12-fold garments, though the exact number of layers changed with the season and with stamina. The point was not weight, it was color. Layers were chosen in combinations that matched the month, a practice called the colors of the season. Spring might ask for willow green over pale pink to echo a riverbank and the first cherries. Autumn might call for russet over yellow to echo maples and torchlight. Men wore long trailing trousers and jackets stiffened with starch and topped with tall hats that announced rank. Cosmetics made the face a kind of calm mask. Faces were dusted with fine white powder. Eyebrows were shaved and painted higher on the forehead. Teeth could be blackened as a sign of adult dignity. Hair for women was grown to extraordinary lengths and combed until it shone like water in deep shade. None of this was decorative in the way we use the word now. It was the daily script, and everyone at court had memorized it. The script for conversation was poetry. A courtier who could not produce a graceful 31-syllable poem on short notice did not belong in a bright pavilion. Lovers and rivals and cousins exchanged poems as naturally as we send messages. A flower left on a threshold carried a poem. A reply that came too late, or chose the wrong seasonal image, could offend as surely as an insult in prose. Poetry contests were social events in themselves. Teams divided by a hanging screen took turns answering a topic set by a referee. Judges weighed not only the lines, but the paper, the calligraphy, even the fragrance the writer had brushed on the sheet. Incense blending was a pastime at this level. People mixed woods and resins, warmed them over charcoal, and judged the resulting scent like musicians judging a chord. The house itself had its forms of privacy and performance. Ladies and their attendants stayed behind blinds. A man might address a blind and receive an answer from a woman he had never seen, and that would be proper. The mystery was part of the charm. Marriages among the elite often meant that the woman remained in her natal home while the man visited by night, announced by soft wheels of an ox cart at the gate and by the whispered passwords of servants who knew when to admit and when to stall. Parents listened to the gossip carefully. A night visit could become a union if poetry remained good and visits remained frequent, and the family saw advantage in the match. Outdoors, the city offered its own spectacles. The Kamo shrines to the north sent a great procession each spring in the Aioi festival, with riders in bright jackets and wreaths of hollyhock leaves against the glare. The Gion rites began as a prayer against pestilence in 869, when the court sent a column of halberds and banners through the streets to pacify angry spirits. Over time, that rite became a yearly reassurance that the city could soothe what it feared. Sumo was presented at court as a dance as much as a bout, with measured steps and formal claps before any attempt to throw an opponent. Ball games with a light deerskin ball tested coordination and cool. The rules did not allow the ball to touch the ground, and looking effortless was the point. Religion threaded through the calendar with 1,000 touches. Monks from the great temples of Mount Hiei and Mount Koya officiated at rites for the realm. Court families sponsored services where sutras were chanted through the night to calm the restless dead and to clear the way for a healthy harvest. Within those circles of old practice, something newer was stirring. In 985, the monk Genshin wrote a compendium that described the tenderness of the Pure Land and the horrors of less fortunate destinations with an immediacy that drew listeners close. The idea that sincere faith in Amida could carry a person to salvation took deep root among courtiers who knew perfectly well that life was beautiful and brief. A few decades later, people would decide that the age of decline had begun in 1052 and would answer with buildings that tried to make paradise visible. For now, that feeling was still a mood around the lamps after midnight, when an old minister stared at the reflection of the moon in a garden pond and wondered how many harvests he had left. Books appeared everywhere. They were copied by hand on paper, colored with dyes, and dusted with mica so the page would have a light of its own. Painters decorated margins with sprays of grass or ships on a narrow sea. The story that would come to stand for the age was composed in installments by a woman serving an empress who liked conversation and had a taste for poetry that could take a joke. Murasaki Shikibu began, most likely in the first years after 1000, to write a long tale about a prince who was handsome and flawed, and who moved through a web of obligations that looked very much like the one she knew. She set scenes in pavilions that felt true. She described robes as if she had folded them herself. She wrote voices that listened to one another. By 1008, her friends were borrowing chapters as fast as she finished them, and someone was probably already practicing a gentle imitation. A book that presents human feelings with quiet accuracy has a way of taking root in any century. Her colleague and rival in letters, Sei Shonagon, wrote a book of lists and glances and sharp notices that she called a pillow book. She worked at the court of another empress, and she looked with a bright and sometimes merciless eye at people who did not know they were being watched on the page. Together, the two books let us hear chairs scrape on the floors of rooms where the air smelled of aloe wood. They let us listen to women whose writing was not constrained by the need to quote Chinese classics in every paragraph. Women at court used the flowing script that came to be called hiragana, and in doing so they gave the language its most natural voice. Men wrote fine diaries as well. A regent named Michinaga kept a record of his days that shows how power in Heian worked when the Fujiwara family dominated the palace around the year 1000. You read his notes and see a city run by visits and letters and favors counted with careful smiles. The arts grew as naturally as shade. Painting in the native style matured into picture scrolls that told stories in long horizontal ribbons. A century later, artists would turn Murasaki's chapters into scenes for those scrolls and would show interiors with roofs set aside so that you could peer down into a room without intruding. Craftsmen perfected a method of joining many small pieces of wood to make larger statues, which meant tall Buddhas could be lighter and more stable. Artisans in workshops along the Kamo made inkstones and brushes, the unglamorous tools that make all the glamour possible. Musicians preserved court tunes that had crossed from China and then found a Japanese tempo. Even the games felt cultivated. Children flew paper butterflies at spring festivals along winding garden streams, and chased cups of wine floated on the current while composing impromptu verse before the cup reached them. With all this refinement came blind spots you could see from across the river. The court relied on provinces run by men who were sometimes better at letters than at collecting taxes. The system of public land allocation continued to fray as temples and noble houses multiplied private estates and drew free farmers into their protection. Ox carts rolled confidently within the capital, while bridges on provincial roads sagged or went missing. The court loved to polish the center and ignored the edges, and at those edges, men who could ride and shoot began to make their own names. For the moment, those men were hired muscle for noble estates. In time, they would become something else. None of that troubled the guests at a moon viewing party on a clear autumn night. A screen had been set near the veranda to catch the reflection of the full moon in its gold leaf. Cups were small because too much wine spoiled the appreciation of the three-line poem everyone would write later. Robes were chosen to catch the light. A breeze lifted a blind at the right moment, so a glimpse could be gained, and a reputation fortified. Someone played a melody slow enough to watch. The beauty was precise, and it was shared. That is the deepest point about the world of Genji. It was not produced by a few solitary geniuses. It was a collective discipline. Clerks who balanced rice ledgers, gardeners who raked gravel into new currents, carpenters who repaired gallery roofs before the rainy season, readers who whispered a chapter to a friend behind a screen, all kept the culture at its pitch. Stand on the bank of the Kamo at dawn in the year 1000, and the city shows the same two faces it showed to Murasaki. There is a private world of bedrooms and blinds and letters scented with forest resins. There is a public world of ranked halls and measured steps and festivals that travel down straight streets to the sound of hooves and bells. Both depend on a countryside that sends rice and timber and men for the guard posts on far coasts. The whole arrangement glitters and creaks at the same time. That tension gives the period its energy and also sets a fuse that will burn through the next century. Walk the straight avenues of Heian-kyo in the late 11th century, and you feel that the city is performing a brave face. The palace still stages grand audiences. The Fujiwara still glide to ceremonies in ox carts with creaking hubs and very polished wheels. Poetry circles still debate whether the moon belongs to the second or third line of a 31-syllable verse. Yet beyond the blinds and lacquer there is a second Japan that is louder and more practical. A Japan of estate stewards, mounted archers, and toll collectors who do not recognize a court decree unless it arrives with men who carry bows as tall as a man. The long arc of the age bends away from the writing brush and toward the bowstring. The reasons begin in fields, not in palaces. The equal field system that looked so clean on paper in Nara times had frayed. Great temples and noble houses collected private estates called shun and won exemptions from many taxes. A farmer on an estate could be more secure than a farmer on public land. Security bought loyalty. Over time, these estates knitted into sprawling blocks that crossed district lines. They needed hard men to guard stored rice, arbitrate quarrels, and escort shipments to port. Those men were called bushi or samurai, at first simply retainers who served, and they began to look to one another more than to the capital for orders. A samurai earned income by protecting a harvest and taking a share of it. He lived near the fields, knew the local roads, and owned a horse that could ford a river in flood. With each season, his status rose. The court tried to keep its hands on the reins. It named provincial governors who were supposed to rule for limited terms. Many governors quickly learned that the surest way to meet a quota of rice and cloth was to hire local muscle. The old police and judicial office called the Kibishi did brave work on the main roads, but it could not be everywhere. In the north, the frontier brought a different test. The Amishi peoples of the Tohoku region knew the land better than any tax officer. Campaigns in the 11th century against strong families there created heroes with bows and a taste for rough camp food. Minamoto no Yoriyoshi and his son Yoshie made reputations in the early 9 Years' War and the later 3 Years' War. Long contests with local magnates that taught everyone several lessons at once. First, that a disciplined band of mounted archers could outlast a larger force that did not have good supply. Second, that loyalty was easier to buy with future land rights than with fine titles. Third, that you could run an army with letters carried on horseback from stockade to stockade, and never once ask the capital for permission. The eastern provinces learned those lessons by heart. Inside Heian-kyo, the court changed shape to meet these realities. The old Fujiwara method of ruling through marriage continued, but it was joined by a new contrivance. Emperors began to step down and rule from behind the scenes as retired or cloistered sovereigns. The first famous example was Emperor Shirakawa in 1086, who discovered that life went better when he put on a black robe and moved to a separate palace where he could issue orders without the formalities of a throne room. His successors Toba and Go Shirakawa kept the habit. The arrangement was a marvel of courtly compromise. The reigning emperor kept sacred radiance. The retired emperor handled cash flow and personnel. Ministers bowed to both and tried to guess which bow mattered more. The new balance loosened Fujiwara control but did not restore order. It multiplied doorways to power. It also multiplied the number of people who needed money for temples, estates, and entertainments. When disputes over land or tolls flared, both sides hired muscle. Monks from Mount Hiei and Kafukuji marched into the capital carrying portable shrines on poles, a way of saying that a god was paying a visit and that the court should listen. Processions of warrior monks were not rare. They knew which streets rattled officials most, and they knew which gates would be opened quickly if someone set a fire at the right corner. The sight of a gilded shrine bobbing on the shoulders of men with staves is one of the less serene images of the Heian Age. Court life still glittered at the turn of the 12th century. A Fujiwara regent could recite a poem about dew on pampas grass with a finesse that would make a modern reader sigh. The diary of an official might still list a fine incense and a better robe as worthy concerns. Yet earthquakes shook the city, fires swept whole wards, and a great storm could undo an entire quarter in an afternoon. The hard facts of maintenance and defense mocked the court's habits of delay. In the great drought of the 1,170 seconds when granaries ran low and people watched the Kamo shrink to a careless thread, the court sent prayers, and the people nodded, and then they looked toward men who could move rice from a distant storehouse to a hungry ward without waiting for a stamp. Taira no Kiyomori understood that world early. He won battles for the court, built a base near the sea at Fukuhara, and made alliances with merchants who mattered. In 1167, he took the title of Grand Minister, the first warrior to climb that high. He married his children into the imperial line and watched a grandson become emperor. He strengthened coastal defenses, encouraged trade with Song China, and made sure that ships in the inland sea belonged to men who would listen when he gave orders. He knew where to place a warehouse and whom to bribe at a port. He was blunt and not modest, and he made enemies freely. The backlash came from every direction. From within the court came conspiracies like the Shishigatani affair of 1177, a long whisper that was answered with arrests and exiles. From the temples came protests that were not entirely pious. From rival warrior houses came smoldering resentment. The Minamoto had not forgotten old defeats. Minamoto no Yoritomo, the son of a leader killed in an earlier struggle, lived under guard in the east for years, kept on a short leash by the victors and watched by families who owed their standing to Taira favor. His time would come. He knew the Kanto roads, and he knew which house would answer a call if it promised estate rights more than honor. The capital felt the strain. In 1177, a great fire ran through the city. In 1180, tax rice was short. The court moved briefly to Kiyomori's coastal base, and then shuffled back to the old palace after finding the air full of salt and the old rituals hard to stage in a port. The Taira forced the enthronement of the child emperor Antoku, son of Kiyomori's daughter, an act that proved their reach and at the same time focused every grievance on a single family. In the same year, a prince named Mochihito issued a call to arms against the Taira. It was heavy on rhetoric and light on immediate effect, but it gave the opposition a voice and a banner. Within months, monasteries and eastern warrior bands were exchanging letters with men who signed themselves Minamoto and who were ready to ride. Meanwhile, the logic of the estates reached its next stage. Men who had long protected a district as unofficial bosses gained official titles as stewards and constables, posts that would soon become the bones of a new order. They kept a slice of the tax, kept their oath to a single strong lord rather than to an office in Kyoto, and taught their sons to do the same. A court that once placed faith in the graceful give and take of letters now faced a ledger of favors owed to men who could burn a granary or save one depending on how they were greeted at the gate. For a sense of the change, stand in a village south of the capital on an autumn afternoon, a few years before the fighting begins in earnest. A steward sits on a veranda with his armor open at the sides, while he listens to a tenant complain about a boundary marker moved by a neighbor. He settles the matter with a quick decision and a promise to send men to reset the stone. Behind the house, a blacksmith works a bellows with his foot and turns a strip of iron into a strap for a saddle. In the fields, men cut rice and stack it on racks to dry. A boy practices drawing a short bow at a post with chalk circles. The steward will ride to the capital next week with a gift for his lord, and then onto a temple to present a prayer tablet in thanks for the harvest. He lives between worlds, and his children will lean farther toward the world that answers quickly and keeps swords oiled. The writers of the time began to tell the story in a new voice. War tales circulated in the capital, first as oral epics handed from minstrel to minstrel, and later as written books. They lingered on the brave gesture that could not save a man, and on the quiet irony that undid a victory. The Heike and its companion tales would not be written down fully until later, but the appetite for that kind of story grew in the years when polite letters could no longer hide the sound of hooves at midnight. By 1180 the veneer had peeled, the palace had moved and moved back, the Taira wore the crown by proxy, the Minamoto gathered in the east in careful numbers, the temples sharpened their arguments. The court still composed an elegant poem for a screen, but merchants in the inland sea were learning that the man who counted cargoes best was a Taira clerk. A generation that had learned to read Genji now learned to read a battle line on a wet plain. All the pieces for a national civil war were on the board. Rivers that once only carried boats filled with festival lanterns would soon carry men with arrows clamped between their teeth. Bridges built for processions would bear the weight of horses galloping in the dark. The elegant city on the plain had raised a culture that could sing forever about the moon. It had also raised a class that could fight for a winter without complaint. The war that finished the Heian Age began with a rumor in a hot summer and ended with a child emperor falling into the sea. Between those moments, the country learned what it meant to be ruled by men who could ride all night and shoot straight in rain. In the spring of 1180, Prince Mochihito issued a call to arms against the Taira. It was more wish than plan, but it gave the scattered enemies of Taira no Kiyomori a banner to gather under. The first clash came fast. Minamoto no Yoritomo, a survivor of earlier defeats and exile in the east, raised his standard in the hills of Izu and was promptly chased into the dark at Ishibashiyama in September 1180. He escaped through bamboo and bad weather with a handful of men and made for the Kanto, a country of wide rivers and tough farmers who knew him. Yoritomo did what he always did best. He built patiently. He courted the great families of the East, promised them office and land rights, and set up his base at Kamakura on a coastal bowl of hills and inlets that felt defensible even in fog. The fighting moved like weather fronts. In late 1180, a Taira army put Nara to the torch after monks there backed the Minamoto. Flames leapt from temple to temple. Todaiji burned so hot that the bronze of the great Buddha slumped and ran. The loss shocked the court and left a scar on the city that would not fade for years. To win, both sides would break things that everyone loved. Kiyomori died early in 1181, and with him went much of the old swagger. His son Munamori led the clan and held Kyoto, but the Taira grip began to loosen. The next 2 years brought famine across the country. Armies marched hungry and villages watched storehouses like hawks. In the north, old quarrels flared into long campaigns that trained a new generation of fighters. The Minamoto name now covered several branches that did not always agree. One cousin, Minamoto no Yoshinaka, rose from Kiso in the mountains with a fierce band of followers and swept down toward the capital along the old Nakasendo road. His men won hard fights in the valleys and reached Kyoto in 1183. The Taira fled west with the young Emperor Antoku and the sacred regalia, a sword, a mirror, and a curved jewel that connected the throne to the age of the gods. The city changed hands and then changed temper. Yoshinaka retook Kyoto like a storm and then behaved like one. He seized the retired Emperor Go Shirakawa, bullied officials, and demanded titles. He had the wild virtue that wins mountain battles, and the wild fault that loses cities. Yoritomo in Kamakura decided that his cousin had to go. He sent his half-brothers Noriori and Yoshitsune west with disciplined eastern troops and a clear order. Drive Yoshinaka out and then turn on the Taira. The result was a winter of speed and skill. In the first days of 1,184 fighting returned to the Uji River south of the capital, a place already famous from an earlier skirmish in 1180 when defenders had ripped planks from the bridge to slow their pursuers. Now Yoshinaka faced Minamoto men under Minamoto banners. He was driven east and killed at Awazu in snow and reeds, a death wrapped later in legends of a companion called Tomoe Gozen, who fought with a bow and a calm face. With Yoshinaka gone, the Minamoto line had one voice again, and that voice spoke from Kamakura. The Taira still held the inland sea and the coasts. They controlled ships, ports, and the flow of tax rice that moved by water. To break them, the Minamoto needed generals who could move faster than letters. Yoshitsune was that kind of general. He was slight and young, and had a gift for reading ground and tide that made older men nervous. In the spring of 1184, he rode with Noriori to the Taira fortress at Ichi no Tani near modern Kobe. The place backed onto steep hills and faced the sea. The Taira thought the slope at their rear was too sharp to climb in armor. Yoshitsune took a small force up anyway, sliding their horses down the last part, and fell on the flank while Noriori pressed from the front. The Taira line broke. The sea filled with boats fleeing along the coast. It was not a final blow, but it turned a clan, used to keeping the enemy in front, into a clan that kept looking over its shoulder. The Taira regrouped at Yashima on Shikoku, their court reduced to pavilions on a beach, their banners salt stiff in the sea wind. In early 1185, Yoshitsune crossed the narrow channels in a night move that left his men lighting fires on their ships to look larger than they were. The Taira, thinking a vast fleet was upon them, took to their boats and pulled away from shore. Yoshitsune made land and fought them from the beach. The fighting was confused and fierce. At one point, a Taira fan was raised on a pole on a ship, and a woman called for a Minamoto archer to knock it down if he could. Nasu no Yoichi rowed out in a small boat, stood, drew, and sent an arrow through the center of the fan. It was bravado, and it was a message. The Taira fled west again, now to the straits between Honshu and Kyushu, the narrow, tidal place called Dan no Ura. Dan no Ura, on the 24th day of the 4th month, in 1185, was a day of wind and current and choice. The Taira had more ships and many good archers. The Minamoto had better pilots and a sense of the tide. The fleets faced each other in ranks. Arrows darkened the air. At first, the Taira had the run of it, their boats sitting high in the water on a fair flow. Then the current turned. Minamoto pilots cut across the lines and drove their bows into the Taira fleet. A key Taira ally betrayed them and told Yoshitsune which ships carried the court and the regalia. Minamoto men boarded those vessels, and the fight became close and frantic. Realizing the day was lost, the grandmother of the child Emperor Antoku gathered him in her arms and leapt into the sea. Others followed. The sacred sword sank. The mirror and the jewel were recovered later, though the stories surrounding them have an air of grief that never quite clears. By afternoon, the Taira line had collapsed. Bodies and banners and broken oars drifted on a tide that carried away one way of living. The war ended on water, but the making of the new order took place on roads. Yoritomo did not come to any of these battles. He stayed in Kamakura and sent letters that changed lives. After Dan no Ura, he sent Yoshitsune and Noriori to secure the west and to make sure no Taira embers could catch light. Yoshitsune returned to Kyoto to warm a claim, too warm for Yoritomo's taste. The brothers fell out. Yoshitsune's brilliance in the field had made him famous. Fame is as dangerous as defeat in a family that is building a government. Accused of disobedience, Yoshitsune fled north to the country of the northern Fujiwara, an old cultured enclave in Hiraizumi that had grown rich on gold and horse pastures and the trade of the far north. For a time they sheltered him. In 1189, Yoritomo forced their hand, marched north, and the last of the northern Fujiwara fell. Yoshitsune died in a small house with a few loyal men. The tale that came later made his last moments a study in grace and bad luck. Yoritomo had removed the only rival who could call Eastern men to a different banner. Even before his formal title arrived, Yoritomo had begun to govern. In 1185, he secured from the court the right to appoint military governors and estate stewards across the provinces. That meant that the men who kept order and gathered taxes answered to Kamakura. In 1192, after the death of the retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa, Yoritomo received the old mouth-filling title of Sei Taishogun. The word that mattered was not in the title, it was the place. Power no longer lived where the emperor sat today. It lived in a low seaside town under wooded hills, in offices that smelled of salt and ink, in courtyards full of horses, and quiet men with lists. If you want to feel the end of the Heian world, stand in Kyoto in the late 1180 seconds and listen. The city still keeps its grid. The Kamo still slides under the bridges. A courtier still writes a small, perfect poem about the shadow of a cloud on a tiled roof. But from the east, the sound you hear is the steady beat of hooves on a hard road. In Kamakura, clerks copy orders that create a new map of duty. Stewards are named for estates. Constables are named for provinces. A chain of loyalties extends down lanes and into paddies. Letters are answered with rice and men, not with clever replies and a branch of plum. The old elegance does not vanish. It shifts into a role that suits ceremony rather than command. The war left stories behind that people told because they carried the taste of salt and iron and loss. Bards sang of the fall of the proud with a line that said the bells of Gion ring with impermanence. They told of Nasu no Yoichi and a fan on a mast, of the young emperor's sleeve dissolving into water, of Yoshinaka dying in reeds, of Yoshitsune jumping from beam to beam in a burning hall as if weightless. Those stories kept the Heian Age near even as the New Age shut its gates at dusk and posted guards who did not care for diaries. If you went looking for the new government after the Genpei War, you would not find it under painted ceilings in Kyoto. You would find it at the end of sandy lanes in a seaside town where black pines lean into the wind and gulls argue over fish guts. Kamakura smelled of salt and wet leather. Horses filled the courtyards. Armor dried on racks. Scribes bent over rough tables and copied orders that could change a province with a few brushstrokes. It was not elegant. It was effective. Minamoto no Yoritomo built this world with careful patience. He kept his distance from court ceremony and set up offices that matched the needs of men who lived by the bow. 3 desks mattered most. The Mandakoro handled finance and daily administration. The Samurai Dokoro kept order among the vassals and knocked heads when needed. The Monchujo heard lawsuits and appeals, a sign that the sword government planned to govern with paper as well as steel. Around those desks stood the network that made Kamakura strong. Vassals called Gokinin swore personal loyalty and promised military service. In return, they received rights in land that gave them a reason to answer quickly when Kamakura sent for them. The land system was the spine. On great estates and on public fields, the shogunate named Jito as stewards who collected rents, hired guards, and kept the peace. In the provinces, it named shugo as constables, who could summon local forces and arrest those who thought a tax road was a free road. These posts cut across older rights and titles. A proud family in Kyoto might own an estate on paper, but if a Kamakura steward took charge of the harvest, the flow of rice obeyed the steward. That was the quiet revolution. The shogunate did not abolish the court. It simply placed its own people between the court and the grain. Yoritomo died in 1199 after a fall from his horse. With him went the simple clarity of a single founder. His son Yorie took the title and quickly found that his wife's family and his father's lieutenants had their own ideas. His younger brother Sanetomo followed, a gentle poet who managed to hold on largely because he allowed others to guard the doors. In 1219, Sanetomo was cut down on the stone steps of Tsurugaoka Hachiman Shrine by a relative who stepped from the shadows with a blade. The main Minamoto line was gone. Power did not collapse with it, because it had already slipped into the hands of the family that had guarded the throne from behind the screens. The Hojo had been building a firm grip from the start. Hojo Masako, Yoritomo's widow, cut her hair and took vows after his death, and never stopped ruling. People called her the nun shogun, and meant it as a compliment. Her father, Hojo Tokimasa, and later her brother Yoshitoki, acted as regents for boy shoguns, who were shoguns mainly in name. They found child princes in Kyoto to wear the title and left the work to Kamakura. The arrangement offended some in the capital. It worked well in a world where messages had to cross mountain passes in rain. A regent could sign quickly. A prince could be taught to smile at ceremonies. The capital did not enjoy being mastered by a town it had once looked down on. In 1221, the retired Emperor Go-Toba tried to break Kamakura's hold. He called banners to Kyoto and ordered loyalists to rise. The Jokyu War was the answer from the east. Hojo Yoshitoki sent a swift army over the old Tokaido Road. It broke the imperial forces near the Uji and Seta rivers and marched into the capital with the steadiness of a flood. The court was humbled. Go-Toba was sent to a distant island. Kamakura set up a permanent headquarters in Kyoto called the Rokuhara Office to watch the court and to seize trouble early. Back in the provinces, the shogunate confiscated the lands of those who had picked the losing side and rewarded Gokinin, who had performed well. The victory fixed the dual order for good. Kyoto held rights and lineage. Kamakura held law and horses. Law under the Hojo became more than habit. In 1232 hours, Zojo Yasutoki issued the Joi Code, a set of rules and principles for judging land disputes and crimes. It was practical and brief. It told judges to look for facts, to weigh testimony, and to remember that custom had force when text was silent. It laid out clear limits on what stewards could skim and how much a man owed in service. It cared more for steady practice than for fine theory. The code sat on the desks of Kamakura officials for generations and gave Japan its first durable warrior law. The same Yasutoki set up a council in Kamakura called the Hyojoshu to hear cases. Men brought bundles of documents tied with string and argued over embankments and mill rights while clerks wrote notes on wooden slips. The business of rule became a daily craft rather than a string of exceptions. Kamakura did not hold itself together without blood. Vassal houses that had grown too large were pruned. In 1213, the Wada were crushed after they tried to force their way to control of a key office. In 1247, the Miura, who could trace a history of service to before Yoritomo, were destroyed after a brief but decisive clash in the city streets. These events did not make Kamakura popular. They made it stable. The Hojo regents could be ruthless and pious in the same week. Hojo Tokiori ruled with a light hand in rhetoric and a firm hand in practice. He reduced show in government, avoided titles, and made decisions in quiet meetings that sent other men far from home. The faiths of the age took on a new shape that fit the temper of a warrior government and a countryside that wanted answers more than parables. Zen teachers arrived with the taste of Chinese tea and the discipline of long sitting. Aisai, a monk who had studied on the continent, founded Jufuku-ji in Kamakura around 1200 and wrote a small book praising tea as a tonic for health and clarity. He helped start Kensho-ji in 1253, a true training temple with halls that taught simplicity as a virtue. A few decades later, Engaku-ji rose as well, its long steps and sober buildings a match for the minds Kamakura wanted to cultivate. Dogen, who had studied deeper in China, returned in 1227 and taught a quiet sitting that reached for insight without ornament. He left the politics of the East and founded Eihei-ji in the North Country, but his words reached Kamakura all the same. Meanwhile, Pure Land teachers offered a path of faith to people who did not have time for study. Honen preached reliance on the name of Amida and gathered followers from every rank. Shinran took that teaching farther, saying that even the most ordinary person could trust in grace. Nichiren fixed on the Lotus Sutra with a single-minded force that frightened officials. He denounced other schools, called for reform, and survived an attempted execution at Tatsunokuchi near Kamakura in 1271, when a strange light in the sky spooked the swordsman. Each movement spoke to people who lived with war, taxes, and storms. The variety tells you how hungry the country was for meaning that matched experience. Culture did not vanish under armor. It changed rooms. In Kamakura, a warrior house was laid out for work. The main hall opened to a yard where horses stood, and men shook dust from cloaks. A small shrine box sat in one corner. A shelf held letters bundled with cords and stamped with red seals. A guest room had clean mats and tea ready. A courtyard might hold a young pine and a rock set where it looked best in rain. Music in this world was simpler and more direct than in Heian salons. Plays from shrine festivals and street troupes began to grow into the art that would later be called No, with masks that caught a single emotion and carried it across a wide space. The great war tale of the age, the Heike, was shaped by blind minstrels who traveled with lutes and a memory for lines. They sang of the proud brought low and of the bell whose sound reminds you that everything changes. You can hear those lines in Kamakura streets after dusk if you listen hard and do not mind standing a long time. Trade found new channels. Merchants in Hakata shipped sulfur, swords, and timber, and brought back Chinese wares and copper coins. Many transactions still counted in rice, but strings of imported Song coins began to clink in purses along the inland sea. Markets formed around temple gates and along ferry landings. Guilds called za grew around particular trades under the protection of temples or nobles. The countryside near Kamakura showed the change in small ways. Tea bushes appeared on slopes. Temple gardens became places to think rather than displays to impress. Carpenters building Zen halls preferred plain wood and good proportions over bright paint. A visiting courtier from Kyoto might find the look severe. A Kamakura steward found it restful. The shogunate built a map of posts that made the whole island a little smaller. The Rokuhara office watched Kyoto and kept the court polite. In Kyushu, a regional headquarters called the Tandai coordinated defense and shipping. Postal stations kept up a steady trade in fresh horses and bad soup. Messengers carried orders that were short and blunt. A steward who cheated too openly found himself outside his gates with a notice nailed to the post and a replacement sitting in his chair. A man who served well could expect his heirs to inherit his rights. Favor and obligation took on the permanence of law. For all its confidence, Kamakura sat on uneasy ground. Literally so. The region is a fold of hills prone to slides, and the sea is short-tempered in typhoon season. In 1257, an earthquake shook the town to kindling, and fires ran through quarters that had been packed too close. In 1293, another fierce shock killed thousands. After that second disaster, a political purge followed hard, proof that men used the cover of crisis to settle scores. The Hojo could face nature with stoicism and enemies with quick knives. Neither habit built deep love. The best way to feel the distance between this age and the one before is to watch a day pass in Kamakura. Morning begins with a stable boy carrying pails of water, while riders test girths in a yard still damp with sea mist. In a small office, a clerk opens a chest, checks the seals on a bundle of suits, and unrolls an order that will send a new constable to a province he will see for the first time. A monk walks the long steps of Kensho-ji and sweeps fallen leaves with a twig broom. In a house near the main road, a steward hears a land case. Two farmers argue about a ditch that moved during a flood. The steward listens, asks about the height of last spring's water, and decides to have the boundary reset where it stood before the storm. He writes a brief note in plain words, stamps it, and sends a copy to the constable. In the afternoon, a visitor from Kyoto arrives with a letter that compliments the regent and asks for leniency for a cousin. He leaves with tea and a polite refusal. After sunset, a biwa player sits on a step and begins the tale of the Heike, while men who have heard it a dozen times already fall quiet again when he reaches the part about the boy emperor and the cold sea. By the middle of the 13th century, the system worked. The court in Kyoto kept rights and refined manners. Kamakura kept order and collected rice. The countryside learned to look east when bandits appeared, and to look to local temples when hunger bit. The Hojo regions had the habit of rule and a sense that they could weather anything if they moved quickly, and did not argue over principle when a post could fix the matter. Then, a new kind of letter arrived. It came across the sea from a ruler in a city most Japanese would never see. It demanded submission. It was written in a tone that assumed the right to command. That letter came from Kublai Khan. The men in Kamakura had never faced a question like it. The first warning did not arrive with sails on the horizon. It arrived folded in silk. In 1266, a letter reached Dazaifu in Kyushu from Kublai Khan, ruler of a new dynasty in China that had swallowed the old song and now looked outward with a calm appetite. The message was direct. Recognize the new order and send tribute. Similar letters followed. Kyoto preferred phrases about imperial ancestry. Kamakura preferred more practical answers. Neither city offered tribute. In 1275, and again in 1279, when envoys came too close with the same request, the shogunate executed them. It was a risky clarity. Kublai did not forget. The first fleet sailed in 1274. It assembled in Korea with soldiers from the Mongol heartland, Chinese marines, and Korean crews who knew how to handle weather in the straits. The numbers in the chronicles are large, but even if you deflate them to a more sober size, the force was something Japan had never faced. This was an army that fought in ranks, used drums and horns to keep time, and had learned the new art of gunpowder. Their ships were not elegant. They were workhorses that could carry men, horses, and jars of water across short seas, and then lie off a beach while archers did their work. The Japanese plan was simple because it had to be. Kyushu was the front door. The post at Dazaifu watched the west. Beacons along the coast stood ready to send smoke by day and fire by night. Local lords called their men and made for Hakata Bay, the best landing in northern Kyushu. The order passed quickly through the structure that Kamakura had built. Constables rallied provincial troops. Estate stewards brought their retainers. Monks at Hakazaki prayed all night and hammered out spearheads in the morning. Fishermen moved their boats up creeks and watched the horizon with narrowed eyes. The first blood came in the islands that guard the straits. Tsushima and Iki were hit hard. Their garrisons were small, their beaches open, and their defenders learned at close hand how much pain a mass of archers can inflict when a shield wall backs them. Survivors drifted to Kyushu with stories of unfamiliar weapons. One report spoke of bombs that burst with a jagged roar and shards of iron, a frightening novelty that the Yuan histories later called thunder crash bombs. It was not magic. It was powder, fire, and metal. It rattled men who had grown up measuring the world by single combat and swordplay. In November 1274, the fleet entered Hakata Bay. The scene looked wrong to Japanese eyes. The invaders advanced in tight blocks, shields forward, arrows steady, drums loud enough to make your ribs quiver. The local warriors moved in to challenge for single combat and found no polite answer, only volleys of shafts and a swift push. The fighting spilled along the strand. Shrines and houses near the water burned. The defenders fell back to higher ground and to the low hills that ring the plain. There the fight changed character. Riders who knew every fold in a ridge and every bend in a stream harried the edges of the invaders, cut off small groups, and tried to keep the landing from turning into a march inland. By nightfall, the beach was a draw in human terms and a danger in practical ones. A fleet that rules a shoreline must sleep at anchor. It must also survive the weather. A squall rolled in after dark. How strong it was has been argued ever since. It was strong enough to push ships against one another and onto shoals. It was strong enough to slash rigging and to throw men into the water who were wearing more armor than was good for swimming. When the clouds moved off, the commanders looked at their maps and chose the cautious course. They pulled away from Hakata and set a return for Korea. The defenders called it a victory. The invaders called it a reconnaissance with lessons learned. Each side prepared for the next round. Kamakura did not wait. Orders went out to fortify the bay with a stone wall. Men hauled rock from quarries and fields and stacked it in a long, low barrier that ran for miles along the curve of the beach. It stood a man high, with a face just steep enough to trouble a climbing foot and a lip strong enough to unnerve a rider. Behind the stones, platforms were cleared for archers and spears. Watch huts went up. Supply dumps were tucked into temple compounds. By the time the second invasion came, Hakata no longer looked like a welcoming strand. It looked like a set of clenched teeth. Years of waiting had effects beyond the shoreline. The shogunate kept men in arms in Kyushu in every season, which meant years of stipends and grain allotments and blades that needed replacing. There was no new land to grant as payment because the enemy held no estates in Japan. Warriors who had fought at Hakata sent petitions describing wounds and losses and expected rewards. Clerks in Kamakura counted rice and struggled to make sense of justice when there was not enough to go around. Moneylenders advanced cash against distant harvests and charged for the risk. Temples accepted land in place of coin. The system creaked even as it held. In the summer of 1281, the Second Fleet came like a weather front that never ended. This time the attack moved in two parts. One force sailed from Korea. Another, larger, sailed from ports in China. The plan was to meet in the waters off northern Kyushu and overwhelm the shoreline by weight alone. The defenders were waiting behind the stone wall with a decade of practice in night attacks. Small boats slid out after dark, grappled with larger ships, and set them on fire. Archers aimed for the dark at the back of a neck. Swordsmen boarded, did their work at arm's length, and slipped away before dawn. The wall made these raids possible. It kept the enemy at exactly the distance where Japanese strength mattered most. The fighting spread across islets and channels. The fleet could not live forever at anchor. It needed wood, water, and wind. The ships from China lagged. The crews were tired. The season crept toward the storms. In the 7th month, a typhoon came down the straits. It did not reason. It simply took the fight out of the fleet. Anchors dragged. Hulls rammed. Masts snapped. The storm drove wrecks onto the shores of Iki and into the inlets around Takashima. The next morning, the beaches were crowded with planks and men who could not swim. Japanese fighters moved along the shallows and finished what the weather had begun. The survivors were few and far from home. Later generations called the storm's divine wind. The word carried gratitude and pride. It also carried a story that was simpler than the reality. The defenders had trained and built and learned new tactics in hard, unglamorous work. The wall at Hakata was not divine. It was stone. Night attacks were not miracles. They were practice and nerve. The storms mattered. So did the months of raids that kept the enemy from landing a proper army and moving inland. The victory belonged to both human and weather. News traveled faster than ships. In Kamakura, the regent offered thanks at Hachiman shrines and sent notices that the gods had favored Japan. Priests in Kyushu held rites of thanksgiving for days on end. Families who had watched the horizon for months let out a long breath. Fishermen went back to their weirs. Farmers took tools from storage and counted what was left of the good season. The country had been saved. The bill was coming due. That bill changed politics. A war that brings new estates enriches victors. A war that repels an invader, leaves most fields exactly where they began. Go-Kenin, who had spent years on defenses and patrols, expected compensation beyond kind words. The shogunate tried to answer with grants, small stipends, and offices. It was not enough. Debts mounted. In 1297, Kamakura issued a debt cancellation edict to give struggling warriors relief, a desperate kindness that angered creditors and proved that the treasury could not answer in coin. The same loyal network that had held through storms began to fray when the weather cleared. The invasions also changed minds. Zen found quick patrons among warriors who had spent nights waiting in armor and learned to value calm that could be summoned on command. Tea moved from temple and court into barracks and estates as a tonic and a small ceremony that steadied the hand. Poets wrote new lines about the sound of wind in pines at Kenshoji that were not simply pious. They were practical thanks that a tree still stood after a gale. The old war tales gained new chapters. The Heike was joined by fresh recitations of island fights and last stands on sandbars, where a friend held a rope in his teeth so you could jump a wide gap. There were costs no edict could balance. Entire fishing villages were emptied of men for seasons at a time. Merchants in Hakata who had backed the wrong borrower watched shops drift into temple hands. Families that had served above their station at the wall could not easily return to quiet deference when the crisis passed. A government that had ruled with confidence began to rely on emergency measures as a habit. The Hojo regents did not lose a battle to the Mongols. They lost time and trust to the aftershocks. The shoreline kept its memory. Walk Hakata Bay today, and you can still find stretches of the old stone barrier where later building has not covered it. The blocks sit a little crooked after so many seasons, but they are still there, a low line against an empty sky. In a museum nearby, there is a helmet dredged from the mud with the sea dried into it, and a jar that once held fresh water for men who never reached land. If you lean close to a painted scroll called The Mongol Invasions, you can see a small boat ghosting toward a huge ship, and a man at the bow, drawing his bow in the dark, while a wave lifts him just enough to give the arrow a clean line. By the end of the 1,280 seconds, the seas were quiet again, but Kamakura was not. The shogunate had spent its authority keeping ships off the beaches. It now faced an inland struggle it did not expect. Courts in Kyoto grew more confident. Discontented warriors in the provinces weighed their loyalties in units of rice rather than in lines from old oaths. The next crisis would not cross the water. It would come through mountain passes with old banners and new grievances. After the storms that broke the Mongol fleets, Kamakura looked steady from a distance. The regents gave thanks at shrines. The walls at Hakata stood firm against an empty sea. Yet the victory had a strange taste. There were no conquered estates to hand out, no new rice lands to quiet hungry creditors. Vassals had spent years on patrol and expected something more than a letter of praise. The shogunate answered with small stipends, offices, and a sweeping debt cancellation in 1297 that pleased debtors and angered lenders. More relief edicts followed in later years. Each one admitted the same thing in polite language. The cupboard was thin. Money has an awkward way of turning problems into movements. In the provinces, stewards who had kept watch on walls now watched ledgers with a frown. They owed pay to men who had fought at Hakata and to farmers who had carried stone for the longshore rampart. The coins that oiled trade in the inland sea were scarce. Temples held promissory notes in place of cash and collected land when notes went unpaid. If you stopped a traveler on the Tokaido and asked about the state of the realm, you might hear a list of small worries that added up to a large one. Roads needed work, ditches filled with silt. A cousin had put his field under the umbrella of a great house to avoid a tax, and now the harvest flowed to a manor far away. The letters from Kamakura still had weight. They no longer had the old shine. In Kyoto, the court read the same weather in a different sky. The retired emperors who had once ruled from behind bamboo blinds had been humbled by the Jokyu War in 1221 and shepherded by Kamakura's Rokuhara office ever since. They had not forgotten. Priests at old temples grumbled that stewards cut into shrine lands. Noble houses that traced their line to princes asked why men from the east should name a constable for a district they had never visited. The idea took hold that the time had come to pull the reins back to the capital. Out of this mix stepped Emperor Go-Daigo. He was clever, stubborn, and certain that the throne should be more than a chair on festival days. In 1331, he began to gather allies with quiet letters and brave talk. Kamakura caught wind and moved to arrest him. He fled south into the hills, then to the mountains near Yoshino, and raised the imperial standard in the trees. The first round went badly. He was captured and sent into exile on Oki Island, a wind-scrubbed place where waves shoulder the rocks clean. He did not yield. His allies moved while he waited, and in 1333, one of the great eastern houses swung the door wide. That moment belongs to Nitta Yoshisada. He rode west with men from the Kanto and came down on Kamakura with a speed that surprised everyone. The town was a bowl of hills cut by narrow lanes and guarded by passes that could be held by small forces. Nitta pressed on all sides. A story says he rode to the strand at Inamuragasaki, cast his sword into the sea, and prayed to the dragon god to pull back the tide. A wind lifted. The water fell just enough to give a way along the bar, and his men poured in from a new flank. Whether the sea obeyed a prayer or a well-timed shift in weather, the effect on hearts was the same. Kamakura fell. The Hojo regents and many of their kin died together at Toshoji, the family temple, ending a line that had steered the country for more than a century. Go-Daigo came back to Kyoto with a plan he called the Kenmu Restoration. He would rule directly. He would strip back the layers of stewards and constables and return lands to the court and to old proprietors. He would reward men who had fought for him with titles that reached into the past. The plan looked fine on paper in a palace hall. It looked thin in a barracks yard. Warrior houses had grown used to practical rites. They preferred a slice of a harvest to a seal on a scroll. When they brought petitions to the new government and found courtiers reading them like poems rather than like orders, they began to reconsider their loyalties. Two names mattered most in the reconsidering: Ashikaga Takauji and his brother Tadayoshi had fought for Kamakura, changed sides when the wind shifted, and helped topple the Hojo. Takauji expected a place near the throne. He received less than he thought, his due and much advice from men who measured honor in different coins. In 1335, a disturbance in the east gave him a reason to raise troops again. He marched from Kyoto as a loyal general, and then turned. He took the city, set Go-Daigo briefly to flight, lost the ground, retook it, and fought his way down to the Kobe coast where the Minatogawa River meets the inland sea. There, in 1336, he beat the emperor's best forces in a hard summer fight and rode back to Kyoto to set up a new arrangement with the calm of a man who understood that capitals reward men who bring rice and keep order. Takauji named a new emperor in Kyoto and installed himself as shogun. Go-Daigo retreated to Yoshino in the south with the sacred mirror and jewel and declared that he remained the true sovereign. For more than 50 years, Japan lived with two courts, one in the old capital, one in the hills, and with a front line that wandered from river to mountain and back again as families weighed advantage, changed banners, and then changed again. The age is remembered as Nanbokucho, the time of the northern and southern courts. It was not civil war on every road. It was a long, uneasy argument, punctuated by hard fights, in which princes wrote letters to cousins and constables, shifted their hats to face the door that opened first. The new shogunate took its name from the lane in Kyoto where it settled. Muramachi was a district of workshops and townhouses. It became a seat of government with the quick confidence of a man putting his desk near a window that caught good light. The Ashikaga did not try to rule from Kamakura. They kept the court in view and tried to please enough of its great families to soften the problem of legitimacy. At the same time, they rebuilt the map of warrior governance. The Kenmu Code of 1336 set out rules for land and rank among the fighting houses, a practical book that paired nicely with an older civil code in the palace. In the provinces, they expanded the powers of the Shugo. A constable who had once gathered men in an emergency now handled arrests, levies, and sometimes the collection of tax rice. Some Shugo combined several provinces into a personal domain and began to look like lords in their own right. The stewards, called Jito, stayed in place where it suited the new order and were replaced where it did not. The patchwork that had spread under Kamakura grew wider and thicker under Muramachi. None of this moved only on paper. The roads felt the change. Couriers who once rode to Kamakura now angled their horses toward Kyoto. Rokuhara fell, and with it the tight grip the East had kept on the palace. Markets in the capital revived with a blend of court taste and warrior money. Zen temples stood with their gates open to men who had slept in armor and now wanted clean lines and quiet rooms. The Ashikaga found that tea could be policy. A well-staged tea at a temple allowed rivals to sit close, look at a good bowl, and speak softly with the host while rain ticked on the eaves. The splendor of earlier centuries did not vanish. It was repurposed. A painter who would once have gilded a hall in Heian now painted sliding doors for a warrior mansion and learned to leave space on purpose. The two court age produced scenes that would have puzzled a courtier of Genji's day. A provincial lord might ride to battle with a lacquered saddle and a helmet shaped like a leaping carp, win a skirmish, and then spend the evening discussing garden stones with a Zen abbot. A steward might settle a boundary dispute in the morning and join a poetry gathering at dusk where the host set a topic about a river fog. The old taste did not die. It learned to live with iron. Meanwhile, the southern court at Yoshino held fast to a stubborn legitimacy. Its partisans were fierce and often poor. They burned manor houses, cut ropes on ferries, and vanished into woods that grew close to the road. A single victory could flip a province. A single marriage could flip it back. The struggle wandered for decades. Children grew up with two calendars in their heads, one for the emperor in Kyoto and one for his cousin in the hills, and with elders who argued at dinner about which rain name to use on a letter. The Ashikaga line found its most assured voice in Yoshimitsu, who rose to power late in the 14th century. He brought the northern and southern courts together in 1392, a peace that had eluded his predecessors, and made Kyoto gleam again with a style that borrowed from court and temple in equal measure. The settlement did not undo the changes that had begun with the fall of Kamakura. It confirmed them. Japan had learned to live with a court that blessed and with a warrior government that governed. If you want a picture that holds the entire shift in a single frame, stand on the veranda of a Zen abbot's hall in Kyoto in the years after the dust settled. In the near view, a dry garden of raked gravel holds a few stones that feel like islands in a wide sea. Beyond the wall, a lane carries pack horses toward a market where coins from across the water clink in bowls. Farther still, a palace roof lifts above trees, pale in morning light. In a room behind you, a clerk copies a land grant in a neat hand that follows the Kenmu code for how to describe a field and a ditch so that no one can pretend later to have misunderstood. The scene is peaceful and busy at once. It is the answer Japan found after Kamakura cracked. Serious rule in workmanlike rooms, a court kept for radiance and right, and a culture that threads both together so that a soldier can drink tea from a bowl a court poet would have admired. The tale of ancient Japan began with gods who stirred the sea and with villages that pressed cords into clay. It passed through rice paddies and halls of tile, through a city of deer and a city of blinds, through mounds of earth and great bronze Buddhas, through a shining prince and a dark river packed with boats. It ends its ancient chapter in rooms where men in plain robes write clear orders and then step into a garden to look at stones, arranged like small continents. The country has learned how to argue with itself without breaking, and how to move from one way of rule to another while keeping faith with songs and shrines. The new government set its table in a Kyoto backstreet and then invited the world to sit down. The Ashikaga shoguns worked close to the old court and learned to use ceremony as deftly as a writ. They did not try to be emperors. They tried to be hosts who kept warriors content, priests busy, merchants active, and poets willing to praise the view. For a time, it worked. Ashikaga Takauji had taken power with a speed that startled even his friends. His heirs learned that force opened doors, but style kept them from slamming shut. The most gifted of them, Yoshimitsu, came to power in the late 14th century and turned a lane called Muromachi into a center that felt both practical and enchanted. He brokered peace between the northern and southern courts in 1392 so that the country could stop arguing over regnal names and get on with living. He courted the great families with offices that meant something and with entertainments that were hard to refuse. He tended ties with China, accepted the formalities required by the Ming court, and opened a regular trade that brought in copper coins, silk, medicine, and good ideas about how to keep books. In return, Japan sent sulfur, swords, lacquer, and the clean timber that Chinese builders prized. Ships from Hakata and Sakai learned the routes as if they were new river roads. If you want to see Yoshimitsu's mind made wood, go to the north of the city where he built a villa called Kitayama. In its grounds he set a shining pavilion that sat over a pond and caught the light in a way that makes even a practical visitor stand still. The top story held a relic of the Buddha. The bottom story held the reflections of pines and clouds and people who came to talk. That pavilion is known as Kinkaku-ji, the Golden Pavilion, and it was not a show of wealth alone. It was a lesson about balance. Court taste could live beside warrior need, and both could bow to the quiet clarity of temples that taught restraint. Patronage reached the theater and changed it forever. A father and son, Kanami and Zeami, took lively shrine performances and street plays and refined them into dramas that could hold a hall in silence. Xiami wrote about flowers that bloom in the mind and about the deep charm that lives beneath a voice. Under Yoshimitsu's eye, they built a repertoire of plays that spoke in chant and drum and a measured walk that could pulse with grief. These no plays became the evening school for men who spent daylight hours speaking in orders and receipts. A warrior could learn from a play that control can be more persuasive than noise. The taste that formed around Yoshimitsu and his successors had a plain beauty that rested the eye. Zen temples shaped it. At Daitokuji and Nanzenji, monks laid out dry gardens where raked gravel and a few stones could suggest islands and distant seas. The rooms that looked onto those gardens were made for talk and for tea. Tea, in this age, stepped out of temples and into private gatherings. Murata Juko, a tea master from Nara, argued for a style that did not need dazzling bowls or gold screens. A small room, a rough cup, a single flower, and good conversation could be enough. That modesty, called taste by another name, suited a class that had learned to feel the wind on night patrols and to count the hours till dawn without fuss. Trade gave the new order its cash and its tempo. Strings of copper coins from China clicked in markets. Merchant guilds under temple protection ran monopolies on sake, oil, and textiles. The port of Sakai grew into a self-confident city of brokers and smiths who became rich enough to sponsor temples and bold enough to protect their own rules. Hakata regained life after the wars and repaired docks that had carried troops in the crisis years. The court bought imported brocades for ritual. The shogunate paid soldiers with rice and let them convert it into coin in towns that buzzed with lenders and buyers who knew the value of a good harvest 2 provinces away. Architecture changed to fit new manners. Great houses added study rooms with built-in shelves and writing desks, the beginning of a style called shoin that favored straight lines and clear spaces, where a scroll and a flower could teach more than clutter. Tatami mats began to set the measure of rooms. Sliding doors took paintings that showed mist and mountain rather than busy crowds. The effect was calm without being blank. A guest could look and then think, which was the point. The peace that Yoshimitsu brokered did not mean rest for every house. The powers of provincial constables grew as they learned to collect taxes and call men to arms without waiting for Kyoto. Some built personal blocks of territory across several provinces and began to act like lords in their own right. The shogunate tried to keep them close with titles and marriages. It worked until a generation arrived that had outgrown old favors. Cracks showed in the mortar. A quarrel over succession in the shogun's house grew rancid. 2 great families in the capital, the Hosokawa and the Yamana, gathered allies across the country and glared at each other across bridges that had carried poetry contests a generation earlier. In 1467, the trouble burst. Fighting began in Kyoto during what the calendar called the first year of Onin. The war that followed ran for more than a decade and left the city scorched and sullen. Houses burned in whole wards. Families that had kept careful genealogies found their records in ash. Temples became forts because their walls were thick and their gates well made. The shogunate lost the habit of command. In the provinces, local lords who had sent troops to Kyoto discovered that they could rule at home without waiting for a letter that never came. The result was an age of many suns, bright and hot and close to the ground. That age had its own communities of confidence. In Kaga province, leagues of believers gathered under the banner of a Pure Land temple and expelled their professional rulers. Elsewhere, town councils learned to fence their neighborhoods and set their own watches. Castles climbed hills that overlooked valleys rich in rice. The keep of a castle began as a watchtower and became a symbol that could be seen from a day's walk away. Peasants did not need to ask which lord held a valley when a new tower stood over it like a finger. Even in the middle of that uncertainty, the arts did not curl up. They adapted. Shrine rooms took on greater polish in the eastern hills of the city under a shogun named Yoshimasa, who loved objects more than order. He retreated from politics and turned to building and collecting. He set a silver-colored pavilion by a pond in a district called Higashiyama and filled rooms with screens that shone like morning mist. He lacked the will to stop the Onin War. He shaped a culture that could make sense after it. Ink painters like Sesshu traveled to China and returned with a method that showed mountain and river in the fewest strokes required to make the scene breathe. Gardeners made spaces that could hold a mind quiet for an hour. Potters found pleasure in a bowl that had a flaw worth loving. By the late 15th century, the country that had once been ruled by a shogunate at the sea had become a quilt of strong regional houses, proud towns, and temples that could call thousands if they chose. The emperor remained a figure of right in Kyoto. The Ashikaga shoguns remained in Muromachi for a while longer. Real decisions were made in rooms where maps were spread and where the talk was about levees and roads and harvest shares. Coins clinked in bowls in market towns. Letters still began with elegant greetings, but they also ended with clear instructions and delivery dates. If you walk Kyoto at dusk in this age, you can still smell the old city under the ash. A No troupe is rehearsing behind a screen. A tea gathering has left a trace of charcoal and a clean taste of hot water in a small room. A monk sets a stone a hand's length to the left and steps back to look again. Beyond the river, carpenters raise a frame for a castle keep that will tell a valley who speaks for it now. The past of shrines and chronicles is in easy reach, and so is a future of walls and plans that will carry Japan into the years of unification.